Welcome to the European Market Open. A minute to go until the start of cash equity trading. I'm Tom McKenzie in London, and here are your top stories. A nation in shock. Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is described as being in a very grave condition after being shot at a campaign event. Pressure on Boris. The Prime Minister faces calls to speed up his exit from Downing Street after resigning. Plus, it is Jobs Day as Fed hawks back another 75 basis point hike, downplaying concerns of a recession. We will get the latest details, of course, on that shocking and tragic event, the very sad news out of Tokyo. But let's focus now for the moment on what's happening in these markets. You did see some gains, of course, on Wall Street, 3 straight stays of gains. You had those hawkish Fed officials, again, pointing to that 75 basis points. And we look ahead to the non-farm payrolls. The survey is 268,000, softer than the previous month, and an unemployment level of 3.6%. The FTSE 100 currently lower just by a notch. We're just a few seconds, of course, into the open here. The political situation in the UK, the uncertainty as we continue to look at who is likely to be the contender taking over then from Boris Johnson, who has said, of course, that he wants to be caretaker until around October. We know, though, there is pressure, as we said in the headlines, on the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to step down more quickly than that. And we know the machinations are at play within Westminster to try to make that happen. The Spanish IBEX down 0.2%, the FTSE 100 now down 0.2, and the CAC 40 is essentially range-bound at this point. Let's switch over to see how things are playing out. We continue to keep a firm eye on euro-dollar. Whether or not we get to parity, Mark Cardmore, of course, of our MLive team, suggesting that the non-farm payrolls data number later today could be consequential in terms of whether we get below 1-to-1 on euro-dollar. Currently at 101. Future stateside pointing to losses of 0.4%. Again, the context of 3 straight days of gains. The 2-year, the 10-year, 2.98. There's yield inversion between the 2s and the 10s. The last time I checked, 2s was around 3%. 10s now 2.98. Brent 104. Just down 0.1%. Let's go straight then to the breaking news that has sent shockwaves across Japan. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has been shot at a political rally and is unresponsive in hospital. Bloomberg Opinions' Gerard Reedy is in Tokyo with more on this. Gerard, what is then the latest on the former Prime Minister's situation and condition?
Well, the latest that we know, unfortunately, there's been no significant update since Prime Minister Kishida spoke a little while ago. He described Abe's condition as grave and said that medics were doing everything in their power to save his life. We know that, according to local reports, that at the scene when he was attacked, he was described as being in a state of cardiopulmonary arrest. That means he had no vital signs, and he was then airlifted to hospital. As of right now, we have no more update on what his condition might be.
And Gerard, we have heard that there is a suspect in custody. What more do we know about this individual?
That's right. We know that he's a man, aged 41 years of age. He is described in reports as being a former member of the country's self-defense forces. We don't know too much about him after that, including any possible motivation he may have had for this attack. He is reported to have told police that he attacked Abe with the intention of killing him. Another unusual turn of events seems to be that the weapon that he was using is described in reports and certainly looks from footage that we've seen from the scene as being some sort of homemade gun that he may have crafted himself. But as to what could possibly have spurred him to, to take this action. We just don't know yet.
Okay, Bloomberg Opinion's Gerard Reedy in Tokyo, again on a shocking and very sad day for the people of Japan as we continue to monitor the breaking news around the former Prime Minister of that country. Right, let's get the Bloomberg First Word News now with Alice Atkins. Alice.
Hi, Tom. President Biden will discuss possible reductions in US tariffs on Chinese goods in a meeting with his advisors set for Friday. But sources tell us it's not clear if he intends to decide on a path forward. Biden has been weighing a decision to remove some of the tariffs to help curb inflation. His predecessor, Donald Trump, imposed duties on some $300 billion worth of Chinese imports. China's Ministry of Finance is considering allowing local governments to sell 1.5 trillion yuan of special bonds in the second half of this year. Sources tell Bloomberg the bond sale will be brought forward from next year's quota. China is rapidly accelerating infrastructure spending to shore up its economy. Boris Johnson is facing pressure from his party to speed up his exit after finally agreeing to quit as Prime Minister following days of political chaos. Johnson's team had suggested he stay on as caretaker until October, while the Conservative Party chooses its next leader. Possible successors include Foreign Secretary Liz Truss and ex-Chancellor Rishi Sunak. A timetable for the contest will be revealed next week. Germany appears to be preparing to ditch its plan to return to strict borrowing limits next year if Russia ends natural gas deliveries to Europe's largest economy. Finance Minister Christian Lindner has argued that Germany and its Eurozone peers must scale back public debt from 2023 to avoid the risk of more deficit spending and higher inflation. But sources tell Bloomberg that the consensus on debt may be shifting. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Tom?
Alice Atkins here in London, thank you. Right, let's get over to Bloomberg's MLive managing editor now, Mark Cudmore. Mark, you are, of course, looking at the Fed on this jobs day. The survey is for 268,000. What is the Goldilocks number? And put it in the context of the unemployment rate that we're seeing there.
Well, Tom, the Goldilocks number is almost always the one that comes in line with consensus and doesn't scare the market. But I do actually think that's a little bit of a glib answer, but I do think it's even more so the case today, where I think dollar strength is one of the issues that is squeezing financial conditions for many economies around the world. And, you know, if we get a good number, well, that should see yields rise, supporting the dollar. If we get a bad number, well, then dollar strength on haven bid. So therefore, an inline number might be particularly Goldilocks today. But I want to talk about the unemployment data today, because I do think that the Fed will definitely do 75 basis points this month, unless there's a shocking turn of events in the next couple of weeks. The real issue for the Fed right now is a credibility issue. They were late to realize that inflation wasn't transitory. They were massively behind the curve. Now, desperately trying to catch up with that story. They can't suddenly switch dovish now. Otherwise, they will lose credibility forevermore. They know that. They've kind of talked about that in the minutes this week. And that is why there will be 75 basis points unless they get a clear narrative to cling to turn dovish. And while unemployment rate is very much a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator, so it's not the best thing to make your decisions on, the point is, here's the narrative. And if they suddenly pull back from being hawkish when unemployment is near the record level, low levels, and the jobs market seems very, very hot, that'll be very hard for them to explain. And that means the inflation problem will explode. And that means they'll have to hike much more later. So expect the Fed to do 75 basis points a day. I'm looking for the jobs data to have an asymmetric reaction function for yield to the top side, because the market recently has got a little bit excited about bonds rallying a little bit from the lows earlier on this year.
Okay, credibility once again in question, of course, for the Fed. As we look ahead to this non-farm payroll, the surveys for 268,000. Mark Cudmore, thank you very much indeed for walking us through what the implications could be when it comes to the Fed's position, of course, the yield story as well, stateside. Joining us now, I'm very pleased to say, is Richard Dunbar, Investment Director, Fund Manager at Standard Life Investments. Richard, good morning. What another tumultuous week across these markets and politically as well, of course. And I want to get to the situation around UK politics shortly. But let me start with what's happening with the Fed and whether it is there a number when it comes to the non-farm payrolls that you're looking at that would change your views on the Fed's reaction function at this point? Are we accurately priced in this market?
Well, essentially, we had thoughts yesterday from the Fed's Bullard and Waller those words, I think, are probably ones we should focus on. They're pretty clear. We're going to get the 75 basis points, then 50 thereafter, then look at 25s beyond there. So I think the Fed's view is pretty clear. I think they've got a clear view of where the economy is heading and what is required. So I suspect you will look at this number closely this afternoon, but I think we should be watching the words or listening to the words come out of the Fed speaker's mouths.
Indeed. Some would point to the fact that they're hawks, but arguably as well, that traction, they are gaining traction with that argument. Bullard, of course, out of the gates early on the need to hike and tighten more quickly than maybe others had expected. When it comes to the clarity then that you're starting to see in terms of the pricing around this market, the expectations around the Fed hawkishness, does that give some space for investors to turn a little bit more bullish? Is that what we've been seeing this week? 3 straight days of gains in the US. The future's now pointing lower. What was behind that move? Was it a bear market rally, or is there something else going on here?
Well, I think in terms of bond markets, I think the acceptance of a slowing economy, the acceptance of tightening financial conditions, the Fed are doing their bit, but certainly markets are extremely doing their bit. Financial conditions are tightening everywhere. The acceptance of slowing economies on this side of the pond and in the US, I think, is much more accepted, generally accepted by investors now. That likelihood of slowing inflation, slowing commodity prices are adding to that greater certainty of slowing inflation. And if you start to believe that Fed target and either the chances of the Fed achieving that or markets themselves achieving that slowing inflation, then bonds, treasuries at sort of 3%, you start to look relatively good value.
Have you increased your exposure then to bonds at these levels?
We have increased our exposure, and I suppose how we describe it is leaning into duration is how we would describe that.
Is that the longer end of the curve then? Are you looking at 10s or the front?
At the 10s,
at the 10s,
more than the front end. So leaning into duration, but at the same time, would we be surprised if we saw a rogue inflation higher print? No. Is there still a tight labour market? Yes. Are there risks in the commodity market? So we might see spikes in commodities? Yes. So are there risks that we could see expectations on inflation swing back and forth? Absolutely. So as I say, not a market to bet the farm on, if you like, but certainly if you believe the Fed and you believe the tightening market conditions or the tightening that markets are doing themselves, then you can start to see value at these sorts of levels.
How much more work is there to do for the equity markets to price in slowing growth, a potential recession?
We think a bit more. It feels like equity markets generally, particularly the US perhaps, are more pricing the yield shift out and the valuation shift and the risk premium attached to that, rather than any particular downgrade in earnings. I suspect buy-side expectations are slightly more cautious than the sell-side published expectations at the moment, but perhaps not cautious enough if you believe that we are heading into a recession. And certainly on this side of the pond, we're certainly seeing stagnation. We may be seeing recession in the UK and Europe, and I suspect that the earnings implication of that is not priced into most equity markets.
Softer commodity prices. Good news for the Fed?
Certainly, and probably a reflection of an investor expectation of slowing economies. So we've got that two-way pool between expectation of recession and the supply side problems in copper, soft commodities, oil that we've talked about much over the past 6, 12, 18 months. In fact, over the past 5 years, we've talked about supply problems in some aspects of the commodity complex. But particularly helpful, that's a big fall we've seen over the past month. Quite a quiet fall, if you like. You've lost probably 10% in the broader commodity.
Is there further to go? Are we starting to top out in terms of the levels that we're seeing across commodities?
I suspect there could be a little more to go, but I think we would be wise not to forget some of those oil price supply constraints, some of those copper supply constraints, and obviously, tragically, the war in Ukraine continues, and we're not going to see huge supply increases on the soft commodities and the wheat side from Ukraine, unfortunately, anytime soon.
101 currently on WTI, just down 0.9%. Brent 104. We're going to get plenty more, very pleased to say, with Richard Dunbar and his calls. Investment Director and Fund Manager at Standard Life Investments Limited does stay with us. More with Richard after the break. Coming up, the UK Conservatives are drawing up accelerated plans to choose Boris Johnson's successor, but who is going to replace him? It's the million-dollar question. More is next, and those details. This is Bloomberg.
companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Welcome back to the Open. We are 15 minutes into your European trading day. You're seeing losses of around 0.2% across the benchmark after 2 days of gains across European equities, 3 days of gains across the US. Talking of the US futures, S&P E-minis pointing lower by 0.4%. A similar picture for the NASDAQ futures as well. We keep an eye on euro dollar as well. 101 currently softer by 0.1%. Non-farm payrolls today. The survey is for 268,000. Later today, of course, out of the US, how that informs our views about the Fed amid this tight labour market. Right, let's get back to what's happening in the UK then. Boris Johnson's plans to remain as caretaker UK Prime Minister, well, they are under increasing pressure as the ruling Conservative Party seeks to accelerate the contest to choose his successor by the end of the summer. For more, we are joined from Westminster by Bloomberg UK reporter Lizzie Burden, who's been watching all of this for us. Of course, Lizzie, what comes next? What do we know about the runners and the riders jockeying then to replace Johnson?
Well, Tom, it's a wide-open race, but if you think back to previous leadership contests, all it takes is a slip of the tongue to knock a candidate out of the running. At the moment, the front-runners are driven by those with military experience and credentials. So the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary Penny Mordaunt, and also Tom Tugendhat, who's never held a senior cabinet position but has served in the armed forces. Of course, because of the war in Ukraine, they are taking the spotlight. But we're also in the midst of a cost of living crisis here in the UK. So that lends the limelight to the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak. He will be hoping that resigning earlier in the week will revive his golden boy status somewhat after that debacle over his wife's tax affairs, but also his involvement in the Partygate scandal. There's also the new Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi, who has already said that he'd be more willing to be a little less frugal than Rishi Sunak when it comes to tax cuts. That might appeal more to the Tory core. I could go on, Tom. There are many, many names, but it's important to note that some of them privately acknowledge that really they don't stand a chance. They know that, but they're merely entering their names into the ring because they want to hope to get a cabinet position in the government of whoever wins this race.
Yeah, indeed, some self-marketing. Well, we saw Jeremy Corbyn did the same thing with Labour, and look what happened. Look what happened there. Lizzie Burden on the ground for us outside Parliament. Thank you for joining us. Still with us is Richard Dunbar, Investment Director and Fund Manager at Standard Life Investments. Richard, are the markets, are UK assets are they complacent about the political risks here? We saw an upside move for sterling. The FTSE 100 arguably delinked from the fundamentals of the UK economy anyway. Gilts, not a huge amount of movement there, more driven by what's happening across US yields. Is there a potential risk here for UK assets?
I think there's always a risk when we see what's going on in Westminster and in Downing Street. I think the slight strength in sterling as the news unfolded yesterday was rational in the sense that whatever comes after this government is likely to demonstrate greater probity and competence than the one that went before it. So virtually any combination will be better. But certainly the problems that were in front of Boris Johnson and his cabinet will be exactly the same problems that are in front of the new Prime Minister and his or her cabinet. The problems of Brexit have not gone away. The problems of the UK economy relative to other economies, we're undoubtedly going up the down escalator relative to other large Western economies. And the problems, as you highlighted there, on taxation. Are they a tax-cutting party or are they a tax-raising party? I know the Bank of England will have a very strong view about the implications of tax cuts and the implications on inflation on tax cuts and their likely actions thereafter on tax cuts. So that balance that was problematic for the Johnson administration will be just as problematic for the new administration. And those differences in philosophy cut through the whole Tory party. So I hesitate to say that the Tory party is in for a more difficult 3 months than the 3 months it's just seen, but it's certainly going to be a difficult 3 months. And I think the idea that they are out of the woods, I think, is naive.
Okay, another challenging and difficult few months for UK politics then. How are you allocating more broadly in this environment, Richard?
It's a complex environment. It's in terms of our general allocation, it's fairly defensive, fairly diversified. As we've seen, we spoke earlier about the bond markets. We've seen huge swings in sentiment in terms of caution on the bond markets to exuberance in the bond markets over the past few weeks, in effect. We've seen caution in equity markets. So we've very cautious equity exposure, fairly defensively positioned within that cautious overall view. As I said earlier, leaning into durations we described, but so trying to add to bond markets where appropriate, but being careful in some of the lower quality bond markets and careful that we know what we own and have a strong view as to what it's worth. These are dangerous times. There's plenty of nominal growth around, but there's also a significant tightening in financial conditions. We've already seen that catch out some of the flakier ends of markets over the past few months, and we need to be careful that doesn't seep into the lower quality but still less flaky ends of the market. So be careful what we own, have a strong view on what it's worth.
Cautious, defensive, maybe taking positions in the long end, the 10-year US looking attractive at these levels. Richard Dunbar, always important to get your insights. Thank you for joining us in the studio this Friday morning. Richard Dunbar, of course, Investment Director and Fund Manager at Standard Life Investments, joining us here in the London studio. Later this hour, Fed hawks Bullard and Waller push for another 75 basis point hike in July. More on the Fed and the US employment picture next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the Open. We are 24 minutes into your European trading day, and European stocks just turning now into positive territory, range-bound essentially after being lower by around 0.2% at the outset of this session on this Friday morning, 25 minutes into the trading day. Future stateside, you're seeing losses of 0.3%. For the S&P E-minis, Nasdaq futures pointing lower by 0.4%. Let's look at some of the individual corporate stories that kind of grabbed our attention, some of the movers for today. First up, Swedish Match. This is a smokeless cigarette company, and it is the stake being built out by Elliott, activist Elliott Investment Management, building a stake in Swedish Match. This is a smokeless tobacco company which has been agreed to be taken over in a $16 billion deal, but the activist investor may want to change that. So a stake being built in Swedish Match by Elliott Investment, gains of 1% there. JD Sports, a new chairman, Andrew Higgins as chairman, coming over from WM Morrison, of course, the supermarket, and Rolls-Royce, the engine maker, up 0.5%, seeing more demand for wide-body jets than previously expected. Right, let's get to the Bloomberg Business Flash now with Alice Atkins. Alice.
Hi, Tom. The HSBC executive at the centre of a row over climate change has resigned from the bank. Stuart Kirk, head of responsible investing for HSBC's asset management unit, said in a LinkedIn post he had quit the lender because of the bank's behaviour towards him since a speech in May. HSBC suspended Kirk days after he used a conference speech to criticise the finance industry for spending too much time worrying about climate change. Volkswagen has broken ground on a new battery plant in Germany. It says the factory marks the first step in an effort to generate more than 20 billion euros in annual revenue by the end of the decade. The venture is one of 6 battery plants VW has planned for Europe. The carmaker's CEO, Herbert Diess, told Bloomberg he expects strong demand for batteries.
We feel now in good shape to get up to 6 plants only in Europe, 20 billion investment, 5,000 people here, 5,000 jobs here, 20,000 jobs in Europe will be created by this endeavor. As you said, we are still open for some more partners because the demand for batteries will be huge because of this transition.
And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom?
Alice Atkins here in London, thank you. Coming up, the UK's Conservatives plan to accelerate the process to choose a new leader. We look at the main contenders to succeed Boris Johnson. That is next. This is Bloomberg.
Nuestro estudio, nuestro experimento, no hemos pintado todos los edificios de blanco, sino estos más asequibles de pintar. Y ya hemos detectado reducciones medias en el área metropolitana de 0,8 grados aproximadamente en un periodo de ola de calor y con picos máximos de 4 grados de disminución en un momento puntual del día, en una zona puntual del día. Y como dices, en una ciudad como Barcelona funciona incluso mejor que las zonas verdes. Según las modificaciones, nos detectan incrementos, o sea, disminuciones de temperaturas mayores con tejados blancos que con incrementos de zonas verdes como tienen planteados el plan director urbanístico.
Crypto, you have a world of young people that want their own financial system and their own culture. And it is very powerful, and I'm a big believer in it.
Wherever you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Link.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to the Open. We are 30 minutes into the European trading day, and here are your top stories. A nation in shock. Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is described as being in very grave condition after being shot at a campaign event. Pressure on Boris. The Prime Minister faces calls to speed up his exit from Downing Street after resigning. Plus, it is jobs day as Fed hawks back another 75 basis point hike, downplaying concerns of a recession. Waller then of the Fed saying he wants to see 75 basis points in July, 50 basis points in September, and then a reassessment of where things stand. The non-farm payroll, the survey, is for 268,000, softer than the previous month. How that plays into, of course, the considerations of the FOMC at a time when unemployment levels are at 3.6%. The tightness of the labour market being justified by Fed Chair Jay Powell as the reason for tightening these economic conditions. The Stock 600 here in Europe, range-bound essentially after losses at the start of the session. Investors and traders struggling to get it back into the green after 2 straight days of gains, 3 straight days of gains stateside. But again, the futures in the US pointing lower by around 0.3%. The DAX is down 18 points, 0.1%. And the FTSE 100, amid all the politics and the uncertainty over who is going to take over from Boris Johnson, currently down just by 3 points. Not a lot of movement across the FTSE 100. Let's switch it over and see how things are playing out across these sectors then. Energy back in the green, up 1.5%. We continue to keep across the decision-making in Beijing around an additional $220 billion of infrastructure spending. Whether or not they do confirm that, Chinese officials could, of course, support the commodities complex going forward. Autos and parts also getting 0.4%. The rest of the sectors here led lower by real estate, travel and leisure as well, by down 0.8%. But really very modest moves that we're seeing here in Europe, a lack of conviction, essentially, as we head up to that non-farm payroll data out of the US. Let's get back to the politics of the UK then. Boris Johnson has yet to leave the building, Downing Street, of course, but the race to succeed him as UK Prime Minister has already gotten underway. For more, we are joined from Westminster by Bloomberg UK reporter Lizzie Burden. Lizzie, get us up to speed on who the main contenders are to replace Johnson. Who's standing out at this point?
Well, Tom, the bookies' favourites at the moment are driven by proximity to Boris Johnson or lack of it, and their experience on the issues of the day. So you've got Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, the former Defence Secretary, and Tom Tugendhat, who has not had a senior cabinet role before, but has served in the armed forces. Of course, all of this is important because of the war in Ukraine. Tugendhat, though, is trying to separate himself off from the rest by saying he'd offer a clean start because he hasn't held a senior cabinet role before, trying to spin that. But then the other issue of the day, of course, is the cost of living crisis. So that helps the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak, and he has tried to present having resigned from Boris Johnson's cabinet as redeeming his reputation somewhat after that scandal over his wife's tax affairs and his involvement in Partygate. But there's also the new Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi, who's said that he'd be more open to tax cuts, which might appeal more to the Tory core.
Indeed. We know, of course, there is pressure on the Prime Minister to step away as caretaker. They've got to put the systems in place. They've got to move forward with the election and the choice, of course, around who's going to take over. What is the Prime Minister facing? Can he really hang on until October?
Well, Tom, at the moment, the leadership election has already started. The Conservatives want to get 2 names down by the 21st of July and then pick 1 by September, but that's not even fast enough for many in the party, including the former Prime Minister, John Major. He says that the interim cabinet probably won't be able to restrain Boris Johnson. But Johnson says that he isn't going to make any radical or strange policy changes as caretaker. There's also the question of whether the opposition will try to bring Boris Johnson down through a vote of no confidence. But really, that looks like an extremely uphill battle when you'd have to have the Tories turn on their own tribe, which they're far less likely to do than turning on their own leader, as we saw yesterday.
Okay, Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden, outside the Houses of Parliament, who's been following all of this, of course, for us on the leadership contest now to take over from the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And for more, very pleased to say we are joined by major Conservative Party donor, John Caldwell, and of course, former entrepreneur as well, and investor. John, thank you for your time this morning. Has your phone been ringing off the hook with these contenders lining up and jockeying to get your support, rhetorical support, financial support? Who's favourite for you at this point?
Well, no, the phone hasn't been ringing crazily, no, because I'm only a supporter of people that.
There we go. Is that Rishi Sunak giving you a call right now, John?
No, it was my partner actually, but you know, I think the Tory party desperately now needs a leader that's dynamic, strong, and does the right things for Britain, and. That comprises of several aspects. I think the ones that Boris has done very well, like supporting Ukraine, is utterly vital, and that must continue. And in my view, accelerate and really lead Europe on this battle against Putin. And that's a crucial element. But also a crucial element is to really run the country like it's a business, because it is a business at the end of the day. We need investment in Britain, in GDP growth, so that we can use our tax revenue to make the lives of poorer people better. And if we don't have a business-type Prime Minister, we'll be in trouble. So I think perhaps somebody like Nadhim Zahawi, because although he's unproven as a politician, he has been a successful businessman. And I think what he did on vaccine rollout was quite amazing. Now, it's a big leap from vaccine rollout to Prime Minister, but I think he could be a very strong contender. But of course, there's other talent in there, like Sajid Javid and Ben Wallace. So we'll have to see how the leadership battle unfolds, but I really want a business leader that can make Britain great.
A business leader that can make Britain great. And John, you've outlined there for us what you think some of the priorities should be for whoever does indeed take over from Boris Johnson. When it comes to the economy, John, where in particular should this new leader focus?
Well, in the short term, attracting inward investment. In the long term, it's the same answer, attracting inward investment. But what I've advised the Conservatives to do for the last 2 years is to create a Silicon Valley of the environment somewhere in the UK, to have an enterprise zone where we try and attract all the brains and all the technology from all around the world on environmental technologies, because that's absolutely the future, not only to save the world, to save the environment, but for Britain's future in terms of exporting technology, products and intellectual property. So that would be a long-term play, a 10-year play, but that is absolutely the vision that any new leader needs to have to really grow Britain's GDP and look after the world.
Okay, so that's from the long term and to the short term, John. Would you be pushing as well? Would you be lobbying for tax cuts at this point?
Well, once again, we do need to make Britain attractive. Now, this is a really incredibly difficult balance, of course, because we've got all the damage to the country's balance sheet done by the pandemic, the damage being done currently by Ukraine, the Ukraine war and Putin. But we have to be attractive. And so it's this terribly difficult balance of running a prudent country balance sheet, but making the country attractive to inward investment. And so, yes, we do need a low tax regime. But of course, that is the big challenge of how to have a low tax regime and still be able to do what we need to do for the poorer people of society and look after the British people's interests.
John, how concerned are you about the damage that's been done to your Conservative Party from this leadership of Boris Johnson, the scandals, and now a leadership contest that could end up being quite toxic? How concerned are you, John, about your Conservative Party rebounding from this?
Well, let's just say it's not my Conservative Party. I'm not dyed-in-the-wool Conservative. I want what's best for Britain. It just so happens that the Conservative Party align mostly with my views. But there's a lot they haven't done that if another party came along that would do that, and that's an environmental Silicon Valley, for instance, I might well be a supporter of those people. But the damage done is huge. You know, I'm afraid that what we inherited with the last election was an incredibly strong position to really change Britain, to make dramatic changes from the power that we had in the Tory party's number of seats. And it's just been frittered away over the last 2 years. And that is devastating, not for me as a Tory, not even just for the Tory party, but for Great Britain. And we need to get our act together, whether that's a Labour Party or a Tory party. Sort of doesn't matter to me as long as they've got the right principles. But unfortunately, I don't think a Labour Party ever will have. So I think we have to support the Tories, but they've got to get their act together, and they've got to get strong, dynamic leadership, clean, moral, ethical, dynamic leadership, and do all the right things.
There we go, the prescription there for the Conservative Party, the next leader from UK Conservative Party, donor, entrepreneur, of course, John Caldwell. Thank you very much for joining us at this tumultuous time for UK politics. Coming up, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is in critical condition after being shot at a political rally. We go live to Tokyo for the latest. This is Bloomberg.
The Indian city of Jamnagar is a money-making machine for Asia's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. His company Reliance has the world's biggest oil refinery complex here in the city. Jamnagar is also where Ambani is making his newest bet, a $10 billion investment in green energy. His ambition is closely aligned with the Indian government's plan to reach net zero emissions by 2070. But Ambani is not alone. India's second richest man, Gautam Adani, has committed $20 billion of investment over the next decade. But India's massive dependencies on fossil fuels have some environmental advocates questioning the realism and sincerity of those green ambitions and those of its two biggest billionaires.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management. It's a challenging dynamic.
We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Welcome back to the Open. We are 43 minutes into your European trading day this Friday. You're now seeing gains of a little over 0.1% across European equities. Futures, though, in the US still pointing lower by around 0.3%. We've seen some move in sovereign bonds as well. We'll break that story out for you shortly. Yields up on BTPs and German bunds. Right, let's get back to the very sad news, of course, the breaking news as well, out of Japan. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is in hospital and unresponsive after he was shot while speaking at a political rally. Current Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has described Abe's condition as grave. Security at the scene in the city of Nara immediately tackled a suspect to the ground, and the man is now in custody. Bloomberg's Lisa Du is in Tokyo. Lisa, what is the latest then on the former Prime Minister's condition?
Yes, it's been a really shocking day here in Japan. As you said, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was shot while giving a speech as part of an election campaign in the town of Nara, which is very close to Kyoto. The latest that we know about his condition, again, it's very serious. We know that he sustained a gunshot wound to the right side of his neck and had internal bleeding on the left side of his chest. While he was being transported to the hospital, he reportedly fell unconscious. And most recently, we heard from his brother, who is actually Japan's current defense minister, that he was receiving a blood transfusion. And that's the latest that we have on Abe's condition, and it's something that we are keeping a very close eye on.
Okay, Bloomberg's Lisa Du in Tokyo on the latest, of course, in terms of the condition of the former Prime Minister. Let's bring in now James Brown. He's an associate professor of political science at Temple University and co-wrote a book titled The Abe Legacy. James, thank you for joining us this morning. Just first of all, your reaction to the events that have been unfolding in Tokyo.
It's a great shock that within Japan, gun crime is really quite rare, and also instances of political violence are unusual. Not unprecedented. There have been a couple of post-war cases, but still nothing comparable to the scale of today's events.
How do you expect Japanese society to kind of react to this event then, given the context you've given us around this being a very rare event and gun crime in this country, the country of Japan, of course, being very rare? What is the societal reaction to this?
Well, absolutely, it's shock at the moment. No one, anticipated that something like this could occur. Abe is a somewhat divisive figure, but that has led to criticism, to protests. I don't think anyone anticipated that it could lead to an assassination attempt. So it's very early, but this could be a moment that for some Japanese would be almost a sort of JFK moment, where people will remember where they were when they heard of this incident.
A JFK moment, potentially, for the people of Japan. And just remind us, James, given your extensive knowledge and research and experience in this area, of the work that this Japanese Prime Minister did, the longest-serving Prime Minister of Japan. We focused a lot on Abenomics. What for you really stands out in terms of the political legacy?
I mean, take your pick, really. You can certainly focus on the economic side of it, but also in terms of foreign and security policy, he made some very important changes. I think the one thing that I focus on is really putting Japan back on the map. Before Abe returned to office in 2012, there was really a period when people weren't paying much attention to Japan anymore. It was seen as a country that maybe had its best days behind it. It was simply being overlooked. There was a revolving door of prime ministers. Every year there seemed to be a different one. Abe, by staying in power for so long, by making important changes, by representing Japan on the world stage, really restored Japan to a position of first-rate importance internationally.
Restoring Japan to a position of first-rate importance internationally. We know as well, I was living in China at the time, managing to balance relationships with Beijing. As Kishida, of course, manages what is, of course, an emotional day for his cabinet, his team, and the people of Japan, how does that legacy continue to inform the current leadership of this country?
Well, a lot of the policies that Prime Minister Kishida is pursuing are the same as Abe. There are some differences when it comes to economics. with Kishida promoting something he describes as new capitalism, which is a bit different from Abenomics. But when it comes to security and foreign policy, you could say that essentially the Kishida administration is continuing with Abe's policies. And a big part of that is getting Japan to play a bigger role internationally and to increase the capabilities of the self-defense forces. That's something Abe did when he was prime minister, and Kishida is pursuing it, including in this goal of increasing the amount of defense spending within Japan and pushing it up towards around 2% of GDP.
Okay, James Brown, Associate Professor of Political Science at Temple University and co-author of the book, The Abe Legacy. The importance, of course, with that context. Thank you for what you've described, as James describes, as a JFK moment for the people of Japan. Coming up, Fed hawks Bullard and Waller push for another 75 basis point hike in July. More on the Fed and the markets next. This is Bloomberg.
The Delhi airport, and behind me you can see SpiceJet 737 MAX aircraft. SpiceJet Chairman Ajay Singh earlier today said that Boeing is going to compensate SpiceJet in form of cash and aircraft. Celebration happening at the Gwalior airport. As you can see, they've literally rolled down the red carpet for SpiceJet Chairman Ajay Singh. There are balloons, there are flowers. This is a big deal for SpiceJet because it is the only Indian operator of Boeing 737 MAX planes currently.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Welcome back to the Open. 52 minutes into the European trading day. You're essentially range-bound across European equities, and investors await that non-farm payrolls number. The survey of 268,000, that is the expectation, softer than the month before. You could have seen a bit of a sell-off when it comes to sovereign bonds as well. Most pronounced BTPs at the 10-year, the long end, and German bunds as well at the front end, the 2-year at 47, just up 8 basis points. A move higher in terms of yields, up close to 9 basis points on the Italian BTPs, currently at 322. We continue, of course, to look at euro dollar, which is flirting with parity now, 1.009, just down 0.7%. And let's kick off there with Garfield Reynolds, our chief rates correspondent for Asia and MLive contributor. Garfield, it seems like parity is getting, well, it's close. It could happen today. The non-farm payrolls number could be the thing that does it.
Well, the pace we've had just now could happen before payrolls. It looks pretty clear that there's a lot of nervousness, particularly in European assets, about what payrolls might bring. We had Fed speakers overnight making it clear they're very keen still on the idea that they might have to go 75 basis points in July to get inflation under control. That, along with the recession fears that are still out there, means the dollar, which these days is the ultimate fear gauge, is very strong at the moment. And if you see that chart that's up on the screen, round about that, it's about $1.015 per euro. That looks to have been a pretty crucial pivot point. And once we went through that just now, I think there's a bunch of positions that probably got blown away, and that's what took us down through 101. Probably there are some more stops, a little bit lower, closer to parity. There's likely to be some fairly strong positions there. So unless something actually breaks on the news front before payrolls, it is unlikely we would go through before then. But if we get a stronger than expected payrolls print, or even stronger than expected wage growth, something like that turning up in the data, that could readily send the dollar higher against a lot of things. And the euro is really among the most vulnerable right now.
What would be the next level for you that you'd be looking at then for euro dollar?
Well, I'd be very interested. I mean, I'd be looking quite nervously at the level that we bounced off just now. It's like 1.007, then maybe 1.005. And if it does get down to parity and goes through it, then probably it would stop at some stage there. But it might go considerably lower, down towards 99 cents or so before it actually comes back, because that's the sort of move that's going to catch a lot of traders unprepared. And one of the issues that's been going on across FX and bonds as well in the post-GFC regulatory and post-COVID central bank stress regime is that there's not a lot of willingness to step in and warehouse risk. So you don't have market makers who are going to say, okay, this level won't sustain, so we're willing to buy and hold because it'll come back. So that can set off some very wild moves.
Okay, Garfield Reynolds, our chief rates correspondent for Asia and MLive, of course, focused on euro dollar ahead of these non-farm payrolls. Again, the survey for 268,000. We check in again on the broader market when it comes to equities. Something of a holding position across European stocks after 2 days of gains. Not a lot of movement. The futures in the US pointing lower by 0.3% on the S&P E-minis. NASDAQ futures pointing lower by 0.4%. And you have a bit of move into sovereign debt then, and yields are lower, whether it comes to Eurozone sovereign and indeed US as well. The 2-year currently in the US at 3%, US 10-year at 2.97. It's a day of non-farm payrolls. We look ahead to that with the hawks, of course, at the Fed, saying 75 basis points is firmly on the table for July. Surveillance Early Edition is up next. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
When you think of cutting-edge technology at sea, you might be thinking of stuff like this. But there's an incoming revolution on the high seas that isn't quite as sexy, but could be significantly more impactful.
Container shipping is the key component of global trade.
About 80 or 90% of all the world's goods are transported at sea at some point.
But there's a significant unseen cost to the modern era of global commerce.
About 3% of all the world's CO2 emissions come from shipping.
3% may not sound like a lot, but that's roughly comparable to the entire CO2 output of Germany. Since reducing trade isn't a likely option, what about a technological improvement to help reduce the emissions from these well-stocked maritime behemoths?
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister.
He needs to go. He can't cling on in this way. His own party have finally concluded that he's unfit to be Prime Minister. They can't now inflict him on the country for the next few months.
The UK is going to have a de facto lame-duck Prime Minister in the midst of what could be a very severe economic downturn.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Danny Berger in London in for Francine Lacqua. Here's what's coming up on today's program. A nation in shock. Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is described as being in a very grave condition after being shot at a campaign event. Pressure on Boris. The Prime Minister faces calls to speed up his exit from Downing Street after resigning. Plus, it's Jobs Day as Fed hawks back another 75 basis point hike, downplaying concerns of a recession. It's a fragile market, a lot of unease throughout the world and throughout these markets today. Stocks little change from where they ended the day yesterday. We're looking at a gain of just 0.1% on these European indices. Euro dollar, the one to watch today, just moments ago was under 101. We've come back slightly from that, but still down 0.6%. We are quickly sliding towards parity between the euro and the dollar. Non-farm payrolls today, that's the big data point to watch out. If it comes in very strong, that could accelerate this drop lower in the euro, which is currently trading at its lowest in 20 years, having to do with energy prices. But again, that rate differential might come more into play depending on what happens with jobs as well later today. UK pound sterling, that's also weaker this morning. That's under 120. Initially got a lift up yesterday after we learned that Boris Johnson was resigning. However, the greater issue in the UK is similar to that of Europe when it comes to the economy. So that taking over is the main force. And finally, 2s, 10s, just wanted to point out that we are still negative here, folks. Much of the curve is inverted, really occurring in the belly. We have Wells Fargo saying, don't start to estimate where we are when we're going to hit a recession because we are already there. We've had the Atlanta Fed GDP Now tracker show 2 quarters of negative growth, which would be the technical sign. But Wells Fargo says, look, it's a weakening consumer. All of that also points to a recession. So that's where we stand on these markets. But let's go back to the tragedy of this morning in Japan. Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is being described as in grave condition. That's after he was shot at a political rally. And all of this we heard from Prime Minister Kishida speaking at an event earlier today, expressing his concern and his desire as well for his recovery. Let's go now to Bloomberg Opinion's Gerard Reedy, who's in Tokyo. Gerard, so, this occurred around 3:30 a.m. London time, so it's been a few hours. Are there any updates? Is there anything we know further about Abe's current condition?
In terms of his current condition, no, there's not too much more that we know. We do know, as you say, that Prime Minister Kishida described his condition as being grave earlier. We also know that his brother, Defense Minister Kishi, he said that Abe had undergone a blood transfusion. But what that means for his condition and for his outlook, we just don't know at this time. Just as I speak to you, his wife Akie has arrived at the hospital where he is being treated. Perhaps we might get an update once she has been updated, maybe in the next few hours.
In terms of the suspect here, we know they've apprehended someone around 40 years of age. We've heard more local reporting about who and what the motive might have been behind this suspect. What have those reports said?
Yeah, there's relatively little that we know at the moment. As you said, we know that a 41-year-old man has been arrested. He essentially gave himself up at the scene. In his conversations with police, he has told them, according to local reports, he has told them that it was his intention to kill Abe, that he bore a grudge against Abe, but he also added somewhat, I guess, sort of confusingly, that his attack was not politically motivated. So once again, we're just going to have to see what more comes out of that in the coming hours and days.
Gerard, for those who are perhaps less familiar with Japan when it comes to the prevalence or lack of prevalence of gun violence, how rare is this? How strange is this for what is a relatively very peaceful country?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Japan would pride itself on being a very safe place to be, and certainly, you know, I would say both attacks on figures of, the types of figure that Abe is, and also gun violence in general, both very unusual. You know, even if a gun is shot and doesn't injure anyone, that will make headlines in the newspapers here. So for both of those things to happen, for, this to be an attack of gun violence on someone like Abe, who is, both domestically and internationally, probably the most well-known Japanese politician of his generation, is quite extraordinary. And I think the nation is in shock over today's events.
Gerard, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Gerard Reedy from Tokyo, again, giving us the latest. Now, as we keep monitor of Abe, the grave condition he's in, of course, he's in the hospital. NHK reporting his wife has also arrived there. We'll continue to bring you updates as we get them. For now, though, let's take a pause on that. Turn to the UK, where Boris Johnson's plans to remain as caretaker prime minister are under increasing pressure. The ruling Conservative Party seeks to accelerate the contest to choose his successor by the end of the summer. Standing by in Westminster is our UK reporter, Lizzie Burden. Lizzie, who would be the main contenders at this point to replace Johnson?
Danny, the bookies' favourites at the moment are Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, the former Defence Secretary, and Tom Tugendhat, who has served in the armed forces but doesn't have much senior cabinet experience, though he's using that he's spinning it as the opportunity for a clean start because of his distance from Boris Johnson amid all these scandals that have led to his downfall. Of course, military experience highly prized with the war in Ukraine going on, but the big other issue of the day, of course, is the cost of living crisis, which helps the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak, but there's also the new Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi. He has expressed that he'd be more open to tax cuts than Rishi Sunak, who is now seen as comparatively frugal, and that may appeal to the Tory core. But it comes down to experience then and the issues of the day and proximity to Boris Johnson, at least in the early stages.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, look, as we're speaking about early stages, there's a lot we don't know here, and one of them surely is, can Johnson actually last as caretaker PMs until a new leader is found?
Well, Danny, if you look at the front of the newspapers today in the UK, it seems that even though he has resigned, it might be too long to stay for some. The process to get a new leader could take until September unless it's accelerated. The Conservative Party wants to cut the candidates down to 2 by July 21st and then pick a new leader with the grassroots membership voting. But some of the voices against that include John Major, the former Conservative Prime Minister. He says that the interim cabinet may not be able to restrain Johnson, though Johnson has said he's not going to do anything radical or strange when it comes to policy. But the pressure will mount on Boris Johnson as we are seeing the Conservatives slide further and further behind Labour in the polls.
Lizzie, thank you very much. Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden at Westminster there. Now, pre-market trading is up and open. Let's give you a look at Twitter has plunged 4%. This comes after a report late yesterday from the Washington Post, the Third Post writing that people on Musk's team said that Twitter can't. This was one. At the jobs data and how it could change your market outlook.
Hi, good morning, Danny. Thanks for having me. Well, first of all, I don't think that any of today's data will change the Federal Reserve's mind. They're pretty clear that they will continue these rate hikes, and also very likely that they will go ahead with another 75 basis points. So I really don't think that any particular data out from the non-farm payroll will be changing anything. So in terms of how we think about the economy, well, we do see that data is clearly slowing across the globe at the moment. Clearly, markets are very focused on the risk of a recession, clearly high probability of that happening. We have turned more cautious on the macro outlook and accordingly have turned also more cautious on our portfolio positioning. In particular, we're quite worried about Europe.
A lot to unpack there. Definitely need to get to Europe as we're on parity watch. But first, so it is an interesting cross current because we know the bulls, Bullard, Waller talking about yesterday, they still want 75 basis points. So on that front, you say, okay, makes sense for yields to move higher. And then the other front, it's this concern of recession. What does that mean for where treasuries go?
Yeah, so we have seen quite a fall in the U.S. Treasury yields recently from a high of 3.5% to a low of about 2.8%. We do think that there's scope for Treasury yields to go back up, primarily because of the fact that the Fed is still hiking. We do believe that bond yields probably usually peak around the time that the Fed would begin to end this rate hiking cycle. So we're really not there yet, although I think markets are pricing in rate cuts actually starting in the first quarter of next year. So we are actually closer to that end compared to previously. So we do think that Treasury yields would rise from here, but equally we do think that if it does go back to the previous level of around 3.5%, that could start to get quite attractive.
So 1001, that is currently where we are on the euro versus the dollar. I mean, just so close to parity. And in your mind, is there any reason to be bullish on the euro right now?
No, I think that there are many reasons to be bearish on the euro even after this significant falls. Well, we're turning really concerned about euro and the euro area as a whole because primarily is the concern on natural gas supply. We're really worried that as we head into the winter, the gas supply would be much more difficult to come by if Russia does weaponize its gas supply, and also we are also worried about the fragmentation in the euro area in terms of the different inflations that the areas are facing, and of course the bond yields of the periphery countries. And I mean, we're also worried that we know that the ECB is working on this anti-fragmentation program, but it is not clear how it is going to actually work, and we feel that there is just less scope for support this time.
Janet, afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining. Janet Mui, Head of Market Analysis at Brewin Dolphin. Want to bring you some breaking lines now coming from Japan. Japan's Montegi, who is a Japanese politician, diplomat, he's serving as the Secretary General of the Liberal Democrat Party, saying that Japan won't give in to violence, election to proceed. Of course, the backdrop for this is former Prime Minister Abe was speaking at a campaign event earlier today when he was shot twice. And again, there were questions as to what this meant for an upcoming election in the upper house set to happen on Sunday. We heard from the current Prime Minister Kishida saying that it was too soon to talk about this. They're now just monitoring Abe and his current condition, which so far far we know he is unresponsive, and it's been described as grave, waiting for updates there. But again, this Japanese official, Motegi, saying that they will not give in to the violence. The election will proceed. Again, that election set to take place on Sunday. Well, coming up, we're going to continue the conversation. Motegi saying that they will be stepping up safety precautions on this as well. All of this coming after Shinzo Abe, the former prime minister of Japan, unresponsive, being shot at a political rally. We'll get back to Tokyo next. This is Bloomberg.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. And the place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, the early edition. I'm Danny Berger in London. Some breaking lines crossing the terminal over the ECB's climate stress test, saying that there's a possibility, a potential for 70 billion euros of losses. The ECB test sees that hit under a disorderly transition, physical risks, climate risks. It says that, though, that 70 billion euro figure, it might still underestimate the bank's climate risks, also saying that most banks don't have robust climate stress test framework. So that's the latest from the ECB there. Still with us today is Janet Mui, head of market analysis at Brewin Dolphin. I mean, look, Janet, a lot of risks for Europe, but looking at what's happening in China, more stimulus announced today. Is there any potential for that sort of stimulus to in turn help Europe? The connection there, do you see any reason to be optimistic?
We see that basically it is more benefiting domestic China more than internationally. First of all, I think, yes, there is stimulus, but I think the scope is nowhere near the scale that was really helpful before, that actually can trickle down to help the global economy. First of all, the scale of that stimulus is not as much. And I think, currently the problem is in Europe is mainly inflation. So half of the inflation in Europe comes from oil, electricity, food, et cetera, et cetera. So it's unclear how, any sort of external support or growth factors can help Europe because it's primarily a domestic Europe inflation problem. So it's really tricky to help Europe at this point. I think, I want to bring back to the point about China.
Sure.
So we are currently more favoring China and the surrounding region because of primarily is because of the potential for more easing and stimulus coming through. That is, is historically quite positive for the Chinese domestic stock market.
Yeah, I mean, we look at, for example, Carlyle. They've slashed the amount of China that they're holding in their fund. Obviously, a different prospect because they're looking at private markets, right? But do you think that the sentiment around China has just gone too far? It's just been too negative?
Yes, we do think that sentiment has gone too negative. I think 2 months ago, I think the valuations start to hit quite attractive entry point. So that's why we have actually increased our exposure to Asia, Japan equities. Valuations are attractive. China is easing while the rest of the world is actually tightening policy. That's really quite distinctive what China is doing. So it really acts as a bit of a hedge for global investors who are looking to diversify, looking for some sort of uncorrelated returns. And also we are seeing China data rebounding from that really bad level, right? We see the PMI follow rebounding because of the easing of the lockdown. So we do think that the worst is probably in the rear mirror for China.
Janet, thank you so much. Great to get all your thoughts this morning. That's Janet Mui, Head of Market Analysis at Brewin Dolphin. Now, coming up, we're continuing to monitor the events in Japan with former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe being described as unresponsive. He was speaking at a political event, a campaign event earlier this morning. He was shot twice. Again, current conditions describe him as unresponsive. We'll get back to Tokyo next.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Danny Berger in London. We are just inching ever closer to reaching euro parity. Euro dollar now trading under 101. It's at its lowest since December 2002, so nearly a 20-year low. This week it sold off more than 3%, the worst week since March of the pandemic, the start of the pandemic of 2020. Really kicked into high gear, that selling after energy prices throughout Europe hitting records, especially in Germany. Of course, the next catalyst could be the payrolls report later today. Will a strong number be the thing that just tips euro dollar over into parity? Well, let's get some of our other top stories today. With the Bloomberg First Word News is Leanne Gerrans. Good morning, Leanne.
Hi, Danny. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida says former leader Shinzo Abe is in a grave condition after being shot in the western city of Nara during a political event. He said the shooting is absolutely unforgivable. One man is now in custody. National broadcaster NHK says a 67-year-old was taken to hospital unconscious and unresponsive. Japan's foreign minister says Sunday's upper house elections will proceed. Now, President Joe Biden will discuss possible reductions in U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods in a meeting with his advisors set for Friday. But sources tell us it's not clear if he intends to decide on a path forward. Biden has been weighing a decision to remove some of the tariffs to help curb inflation. His predecessor, Donald Trump, imposed duties on some $300 billion worth of Chinese imports. Former European and world football chiefs Sepp Blatter and Michel Platini have been acquitted by a Swiss court following a trial over suspected fraud. That's according to the AFP news agency. Switzerland's federal criminal court rejected the prosecution's request for a suspended prison sentence of 1 year and 8 months, while Blatter and Platini maintained their innocence throughout that trial. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Danny.
Leanne, thanks so much. Coming up on the program, the UK's Conservatives are accelerating plans to choose Boris Johnson's successor. But who will replace him? Again, that debate yesterday saw the sterling pop above 120. At the moment on cable, we are trading at 119. Of course, there were potential buying opportunities if this meant soft relations with the EU. But again, those inflation concerns and economic concerns acute in the UK. More on that next. This is Bloomberg.
Energy prices and a short supply of key chemicals that produce synthetic fertilizers are sending pig, cow and horse manure prices soaring. Even human waste is in demand as farmers hunt for alternatives. Fertilizer helps increase crop yields.
You can see how much moisture is held into this. It's a lot of organic material into the compost, so it breaks down. The manure and the straw breaks down into a friable mix that can be mixed into your soil in the ground and for growing a whole range of different vegetables. Holds the nutrients in, holds the water in, and it really increases the kind of biodynamic profile of the soil.
The recent price spike could mean more farmers going organic for the long term.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now,
You can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Stocked early enough all these precious materials you were just mentioning, and we were on the lucky side that our prognosis was spot on in a way, forecasting what kind of material we would need and what quantity we would need.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
A nation in shock. Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is described as being in a very grave condition after being shot at a campaign event. Pressure on Boris, the Prime Minister, faces calls to speed up his exit from Downing Street after resigning. Plus, it's Jobs Day as Fed hawks back another 75 basis point hike, downplaying concerns of recession. Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. This is the early edition. I'm Danny Berger in London. A lot of unease today, and with that, let's get straight to the breaking news that earlier this morning, Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at a political event was shot. He currently is being described as in grave condition. We also heard from the current Prime Minister Kishida, who again said that he was in a grave condition and wished for his recovery, as we all are at this moment. For more, let's get to Bloomberg Opinion's Gerard Reedy, who is in Tokyo. Gerard, we're hearing from the Secretary General of the LDP when it comes to the elections taking place this Sunday. Sounds like they're still going to occur.
Yeah, it looks like, as you said, Motegi said that the elections were going to go ahead. I think for a couple of hours there, it wasn't sure what the potential ramifications might be of today's attack on Sunday's elections. I am assuming that they are content now that it was a one-off attack and that there is no danger to to the elections. And Motegi, as you said, has said that Japan won't be cowed into making changes to the elections that are going to take place.
And in terms of the current conditions of the former Prime Minister Abe, of course, he was speaking at a campaign event for those elections on Sunday. We know that he's in a grave condition. Is that about as much as we know at this point, Gerard?
Yeah, unfortunately, we have no update. I guess it's been about 6 hours now since the attack itself occurred. We heard initially that he was found without life signs immediately after the attack. Kishida described his condition as grave earlier. We also heard from his brother, Defense Minister Kishi, who said that Abe had undergone blood transfusions. We don't know really what that means for his condition or his prognosis. A short while ago, his wife, Akie, arrived at the hospital where he's being treated. It's possible we might hear some more in the coming hours.
And I should note that the Japanese Finance Minister Suzuki is currently speaking in Tokyo, going back to what we were initially speaking about, Gerard, saying that to change the election plans would mean a loss for democracy. Now, when it comes to this type of violence, again, we have a T-Live blog going up right now. It talks about the idea that there were only 10 incidents of gun violence in Japan last year. How strange is this? How rare is this for this type of violence to occur?
Yeah, I think both in terms of gun violence itself and attacks on, such prominent figures as Abe, both of these things by themselves are very rare, and to have them coincide in today's attack, almost unprecedented, I would say, especially when it comes to someone with the sort of both domestic and international profile that Abe has. Gun violence is not really a thing here. If a gun is fired, even if it doesn't hit anyone, that will make national headlines here because it's just such a rare event to happen. Certainly not what you would expect to happen in a country that has historically prided itself on being a safe society.
Gerard, thank you so much for keeping us updated throughout the morning and your evening Tokyo time. Gerard Reedy there of Bloomberg Opinion. Again, the latest we've heard, the Japanese Finance Minister confirming that there will be an election, saying that to change the election plans would mean a loss for democracy. We'll keep you on top as all those headlines coming out of Tokyo as we receive them. Let's take a pause on that for now, though, and turn to the UK, where Boris Johnson's plan to remain as caretaker UK Prime Minister are under increasing pressure. The ruling Conservative Party is seeking to accelerate the contest to choose his successor by the end of the summer. For more, let's go to Westminster, where we're joined by Bloomberg UK reporter Lizzie Burden. Lizzie, looking for a successor, who could that possibly be?
Danny, it's a wide open race at this early stage, but the initial favourites from the bookies are Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, the ex-Defence Secretary, and Tom Tugendhat, who has served in the armed forces, though he hasn't held a senior cabinet role. He's using that to his advantage. He's saying that he could provide a clean slate because of his distance from Boris Johnson and all the scandals that mean he has had to step down. Of course, military experience highly prized because of the war in Ukraine going on at this moment. But the other thing that's happening in the UK is the cost of living crisis. So that helps Rishi Sunak, the ex-chancellor who resigned this week. He'll be hoping his resignation can rehabilitate his image somewhat after the debacle over his wife's tax affairs, his involvement in the Partygate scandal. Then, of course, there's also his replacement, the new Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi. He's signalled his willingness to be less frugal fiscally than Rishi Sunak. That could appeal to the Tory core. You heard a donor being interviewed on Bloomberg TV earlier saying that we need to make Britain more attractive, perhaps through tax cuts. It's a difficult one to call at this stage, but the Tories want to whittle it down to two names by July the 21st, pick a leader by September, but even that's not fast enough for many in the party who want to see Boris Johnson out already.
Lizzie, thank you very much. Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden there. Now we're joined by Lord Jim O'Neill, former Goldman Sachs Asset Management Chairman and ex-UK government minister. Jim, thanks so much for joining us. And as much as an economist, you are also a historian of these markets, of this world, looking at the period of unease, of upheaval that we're going through, whether it's senseless violence in Japan that we're dealing with at the moment, whether it be political upheaval in the UK, the prospect of war still ongoing. What does history tell us about these moments of upheaval, of where we move from here?
Well, I think you're being very complimentary. I'm not sure I'm a seasoned, experienced person to offer historical perspective, but I won't miss the chance. You know, I think the real thing is, in my opinion, that these moments pass. They always seem so staggering when we go through them, and in that regard, it's shocking to wake up this morning and hear the news about the tragic shooting in Japan. But you know, these moments pass, and however difficult they are in that case, and the chaos here in the UK with the Tory mess. That, you know, our democracies should be strong enough to somehow rebound from these issues. And indeed, one might argue, as it relates to the UK at least, here's a sign of democracy working even inside the Tory machine. So, you know, I also want to add, in the broader context of the Russian invasion and COVID reappearing here and everywhere else, you know, one of the few things I learned in close to 40 years of being immersed in all this stuff is never let a crisis go to waste. There's always a tomorrow for at least some people.
Jim, no surprise that not only you humble but eloquent as well. You certainly sell yourself short. Look, you've been in the room in this country when many of the important decisions are being made. What must it be like now trying to continue fiscal policy, to continue the function of this government when there are these questions over leadership?
Well, I think it's quite clear there's a lot of emotion driving what's being said in the past 24 hours. If you look at Boris Johnson's speech yesterday, full of emotion and full of vindictiveness, really. One might say consistent with his general style that nothing ever is his problem, it's always everybody else's fault. But I can, given how he, within the past few weeks said he expected to be there for a third term, he must be, pretty shell-shocked. And I think a lot of people who are focusing so much on the issue about him staying on till September are also understandably being very emotional. But in reality, I think what's going to happen here is somebody has to be the caretaker until we get a new leader and therefore a new prime minister. And the quicker that can happen, arguably the better. Although I quickly add, below the surface, and I'm sure we'll see it when leading candidates emerge, the Tory party needs to figure out what it really stands for in this contemporary era about global and domestic issues.
To that point, what would we be looking for because of the issues? I mean, not just the UK, but the globe, but especially the UK is dealing with. What would we look for from the next government to tackle those types of things?
I mean, I think it, a part of Boris's problem on top of his personality is he seems to want to be popular about everything. So he would promise everything and deny everything. And so constantly talking about lower taxes, but taking tax rates to the highest levels in a long, long time. And at the same time, spending public money as though it just came off a tree. And I think, it's not easy because there's some big issues around that policymakers have to deal with. But I think the Tory party has to, through this election campaign, rebuild itself still after Brexit. A slightly encouraging sign, as an example I'd give you, the appointment of Greg Clark as the new Housing and Levelling Up Minister is a very interesting development, even though it's possibly only temporary, because Greg is a seasoned policymaker from the pragmatic side and would have been associated with the Remain fringe. And so we need the next leader to be adult and to have a cabinet of the most capable people that can help deliver a coherent economic policy for the UK that needs to be centered around serious initiatives to boost UK productivity.
Who do you think would be up to that task?
To be really honest with you, it's not entirely clear to me at the start of this. And indeed, if you look over the long history of how Tory leaders emerge, it's not impossible that a name will appear through the process which just that person seems to have the grasp of the complexity of the challenges and the voting base of the country. But we need somebody, to put it in the context of a Bloomberg audience, that sort of makes capitalism work better for more people. The UK growth performance since the financial crisis in 2008 hasn't actually been that bad by European or G7 standards, but it's been dominated by massive increases in low-paid employment with dreadful productivity. And given that our labour force is now not rising by anything like the level it once was, the only way we can get growth is by boosting productivity, unless we're going to have permanently higher inflation. And it's not it's tough to pull that off, but we need a proper plan.
Well, we've had Zahawi come in and take a different tone, perhaps, than Sunak, talking about tax cuts, for example, looking between the two of them in a new direction, perhaps coming from Zahawi. Which of them to you seems better equipped to take us, as you point out, that way towards capitalism and competitiveness for the UK economy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to some degree, I'm going to say I'm not sure either does. I think we need to have a much more clearer framework for what is the goal of fiscal policy. All this talk about tax cuts, and I see Tom Tugendhat has already said that for his campaign in the Telegraph today, is very dangerous. in the current environment, both socially and economically, particularly the talk of corporate tax cuts. In an era where wealth inequality has risen a lot and perceptions of inequality have risen further, and the government claims it's focused on levelling up and doing so much to help people left behind, why on earth is there an urgent need to cut corporate taxes when there is no evidence in the past 20 years that lower corporate taxes have actually contributed to higher investment spending or productivity? It's just a standard popular gimmick amongst business friends of the Tory party, and that's really quite worrying, in my opinion. What we need is, I would argue, and I'm campaigning for this, we need a whole new approach to fiscal policy that I'd call it a very modern adult version of what became known as the Golden Rule under the early days of the Blair leadership. And by that, I'm not suggesting it's a Labour approach. We need a much more imaginative approach here in the UK, in Europe, and around the developed world, so we can have government spending on investments to help
Jim,
productivity
I'm going to have to jump
many
in
parts
there.
of the world. And
We're up against a commercial break.
Sure.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end things there. Really appreciate you joining us this morning. A timely conversation there with Lord Jim O'Neill, former Goldman Sachs Asset Management Chairman and ex-UK government minister. Thanks again for joining us. Now, coming up, we're going to be joined by British businesswoman Penny Hughes, the former head of Coca-Cola for Britain and Ireland. She switched her focus to the property market. We'll get more into the UK business story next. This is Bloomberg.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Let's go straight to breaking news this morning. NHK reporting that the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has been pronounced dead. This is, of course, after earlier this morning around 3:30 a.m. UK time. Shinzo Abe, the former Prime Minister, was speaking at a campaign event. He was shot twice. He was quickly transported to a hospital. From there, we knew his condition was grave. But again, NHK reporting now that the former prime minister has died. He, of course, leaves behind him a very, very hefty legacy, to put it in the least. Shinzo Abe bringing stability back to Japan, strengthening relations between the U.S. and China, a loss that is very felt throughout not just the world, but of course Japan as well. At the moment, there are elections set to take place on Sunday. Finance Minister Suzuki did tell the press moments ago that plans to change the election would mean a loss for democracy. Again, that was before, as we have just learned, that the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan has died. NHK is currently reporting that. He had died from gunshot wounds. He was speaking at a political event in Nara, that's the western part of Western Japan. Shinzo Abe was 67 years old. Of course, among this audience, he's very widely known for his Abenomics as the country dealt with the financial crisis, pushing into negative rates. But it's not just the impact on the economy. Again, it is the legacy he leaves behind when it comes to politics. It was a very tumultuous time in Japanese politics before Abe was at the helm. Went through a variety of prime ministers before Abe, including himself, I should say, but he stepped in as the prime minister, ushering this period of more consistency than Japan had seen in some time. So again, the latest lines that former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan has died. He was speaking again at a political event this morning. He was shot twice. The suspect has been apprehended. The suspect is in his 40s. Again, worth reiterating how rare gun crime is in Japan. It is very difficult to obtain a gun. And at the same time, last year, there were only 10 cases of gun-related incidents. And again, incidents, not necessarily gun violence. It just underscores how rare this is for the country. Again, NHK reporting that Shinzo Abe, the former Prime Minister of Japan, has died. He has died from gunshot wounds. He was quickly transported to the hospital. His wife moments ago was seen going into the hospital, so she surely is beside him as well. Again, a tragedy occurring in Japan. He leaves, again, a really big legacy as well. We heard earlier in the morning as well from the current Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, visibly shaken of this news, as I'm sure many in Japan are. And now let's dig further into this. I want to take us to Tokyo at the moment. We've been speaking all this morning with Bloomberg's opinion Gerold Reedy, who's standing by. So Gerold, we of course were monitoring. We knew he was in a grave condition. There were a lot of concerns around Abe, but again, the latest news coming from NHK that the former Prime Minister of Japan has died. Tell us about the kind of legacy that Abe leaves behind him.
Yeah, this is really extraordinary news, even knowing, having been about 6 hours from the attack and knowing that news like this was likely. Abe can only be described, I think, as a political giant in Japan, the most influential and most well-known politician of his generation. Two-time Prime Minister who came back from the ignominy of his short-lived first tenure to come back and become the longest-serving Prime Minister in Japanese history. A swath of accomplishments that he was able to get through during his time in power, including long-lasting changes to Japan's security legislation, extraordinary monetary easing that he implemented that really got Japan out of the deflationary spiral that it was in, putting the economy on a much better track than it was on before, supporting reconstruction from the earthquake in 2011, and many other extraordinary things, including, of course, bringing the Olympics to Japan, bringing Japan into the TPP. Really, the list of his legacies and his accomplishments is too long to go through here.
And again, for those just tuning into the program now, again, NHK reporting that former Japanese Prime Minister Abe has been declared dead at the hospital he is currently at. He was receiving treatment in the Nara prefecture, where again, he was shot twice following a campaign event. Abe was 67 years old. Geroid, in terms of what happens now, again, comments as to Sunday's election, which Abe had been campaigning for, these comments, of course, occurred before we learned the news of his tragic death. But at the moment, it does seem like those Sunday elections are going to continue. How will this color and shape those elections with this tragic passing?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to say. I think they will try to go ahead with the elections, as you say. Several cabinet ministers said that the elections will go ahead, though, of course, you know, that final decision might not be up to them. I do think the elections will go ahead. As to what impact this has, I almost hesitate to speculate, given how unprecedented an event this is. My best guess would be that you would see, you know, a greater turnout than maybe otherwise you would have, and greater support for the LDP than perhaps otherwise you would have. But I think we'll just have to see how that plays out on Sunday. I would suggest it's the least of our concerns right now.
Absolutely. Again, it is a tragedy. Geroid, in terms of the suspect in this case who has been apprehended, what do we know there?
Right now, there's very little that we do know. We know he's a man aged 41. He is reported to be a former member of the self-defense forces, which in and of itself is unusual. There's varying reports coming out right now of his conversations with police. He was taken into custody rather immediately after the shooting. According to one report, he said that he did intend to kill Abe because he bore a grudge against him, but he also said that his grudge was not politically motivated. According to another report in the Mainichi, he said, he's alleged to have said, that he was trying to shoot someone else who was not even reportedly at the speech. It's not really clear if what he is saying right now is intended to be a deception or really who knows. At this point in time, police have just begun to search his apartment. Perhaps we'll know a little bit more a little bit after that.
Also, I want to note for our audience that the hospital where Abe has died, the former prime minister, has now said that they will be holding a brief at 6 p.m. local time in Japan. So we will bring you that as it occurs. And as we wrap up this hour, Geroid, I think, again, we should really emphasize just how huge of a figure Abe was, not just in politics, but in Japan. Only about 30 seconds here, Geroid, but tell us again this legacy, especially when it comes to international relations.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Abe really sort of changed Japan's position in the world, I think, from, you know, where it was, if you remember, you know, in 2012 after the earthquake. He really sort of shifted the narrative on Japan and, of course, was a huge figure within the LDP itself, leading its largest faction still.
Geroid, thank you so much for joining us again. We'll continue to monitor the response. Tragedy in Japan. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe declared dead. Again, a tragedy for Japan.
We know that it's highly transmissible. We know that 2 doses of vaccines, Pfizer vaccine specifically, neutralize the virus, but not as efficiently, because various studies showing that reduction up to 40-fold, meaning that a 3rd dose is a must for it to successfully neutralize the variant. What we don't know is still that what are the effects of mix and matching between vaccines and what are the capabilities of antibodies produced from this mix and matching in neutralizing Omicron. Because as we know, many parts of the world use different types of vaccines. And that would be a great data to look at. It will be also great to look at, because majority of the studies done, uses a small sample number, and most of the time, when you translate it to real world, the data changes. So it will be really good to look at large-scale data of the ability of antibodies from vaccines to neutralize this variant. Grateful here today that the virus, Omicron variant, still uses ACE2 receptor as its main entry. It means that all of the vaccines which are designed with spike in mind still works. Imagine if it uses a different receptor other than ACE2. None of the vaccines would work today. So I think that is the best news that we got from all these studies which came recently, the past couple of days.
Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
It's a great question.
Great question.
Great question.
Great question.
Great question.
That's going to be the best question I get all night.
I'm glad you asked that. Bloomberg Television. Top experts. Great questions. A lot's happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
It's a challenging dynamic. We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is a market that, over the past few weeks, has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Anna Edwards, Matt Miller, and Kaylee Lines.
It is 10 a.m. in London, 5 a.m. in New York, and 5 p.m. in Hong Kong. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller with Kaylee Lines in New York. Guy Johnson stepping in for Anna Edwards in London. Our top story today, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has died after being shot at a campaign event. That's according to NHK. It's stunning news in a country where political violence and guns are very rare. The Federal Reserve hawks are still pushing for a 75 basis point hike this month to fight inflation. Today's U.S. jobs report will likely factor into the central bank's decision. And Boris Johnson is pressed to make a quick exit from number 10 and Chequers. The Conservative Party wants to choose his successor by the end of the summer. So, Kaylee, we've got this shocking news that the former Prime Minister of Japan, the longest-serving Prime Minister in post-war history, has died of a gunshot.
Yeah, a tragedy in Japan, but of course there is a real economic legacy we will dig into throughout this hour. The Abenomics legacy, where this leaves Japan, will be something that we continue to focus on. Now, of course, for Asian markets, the news that he had been shot did hit about midway through the session, and as a result, you saw stocks coming off of session highs. The MSCI Asia Pacific Index only up about 0.4%, and in Japan, the Nikkei 225 ending the day about 0.1% higher after previously being as high as 1.5%. But of course, that equity action does not actually reflect the news that we have had confirmation, according to NHK, that Abe has indeed died from that gunshot wound. Now, you did see some strength coming into the Japanese yen. That may be a bit due to the uncertainty caused by an event like this, a bit of a bid for a haven asset. There's also the question of how this may alter policy going forward, both on the fiscal and monetary side. Right now, the yen is trading at 135.71 against the dollar, and that bid for a haven not really reflected in the bond market, which seems to be back focused on the idea that central banks are going to be tightening policy aggressively to tame inflation. So you're seeing a lot of movement continually at the short end of the curve. The 2-year yield in Australia overnight up about 6 basis points, Guy.
Let's talk about what's happening here in Europe. We're waiting for the payrolls number, basically. We've got an eye on what's happening in Japan, but we are looking forward to what's happening with payrolls. European equities are kind of drifting sideways at the moment, a little lower, but not by much. The only market that's really seeing significant downside is the CAC 40 in Paris, where the FTSE is only down by 0.3%. So we're going sideways there. In terms of where the real action is, I think it's in the foreign exchange markets and it's also in the energy markets. Those are the two areas you want to be paying attention to right now. So stocks going nowhere. Euro dollar we are definitely on parity watch. If we get a strong payroll today, could that be enough to tip the euro through parity against the US dollar? We'll continue to watch that very carefully. We're down by around 0.5%. But this is the trade I think you want to pay attention to. What is happening with natural gas is where the real action is in Europe. Gas prices have surged. I think we're going to have another week higher. We've got electricity prices absolutely surging. Electricity is becoming a luxury here in Europe. It is going to do significant damage at these prices to the economic trajectory of Europe. The ECB's in a real bind as a result of that. That euro story, a reflection of dollar strength, but also of significant euro weakness. 10-year German bonds, as you can see, catching a little bit of a bid. We are coming down again. Yields just coming down a little bit, but it's been such a topsy-turvy week for bond markets. We are awaiting, Matt, to see what happens with that story with payrolls a little bit later on. But we're looking both ways. We're looking east and west today. Payrolls west. East, we're watching very firmly what is happening out in Japan.
Yeah, absolutely. A tragic and historic day. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has reportedly died. We're going to be covering that story for you, of course, very shortly. I just want to quickly point out what's happening in markets. Of course, a lot of times traders will sit on their hands until the payrolls number comes out. That's just about 3.5 hours from now. S&P futures down, so maybe we give up some of the gains that we've made this week. It's been a pretty decent week for the S&P, especially for tech stocks. The NASDAQ was up 2.3% yesterday. U.S. 10-year yield coming down just a couple of basis points right now at 297.42 as investors buy up that debt. And crude, speaking of topsy-turvy, it's been a very volatile week for crude, bouncing up and down through the $100 mark. Right now, Texas Intermediate at 101.73 a barrel, so giving up some of the gains that we saw yesterday. Bitcoin right now down about 1%, but at $21,381. It's been a decent week for the digital asset. Now, our top story has to be former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He has reportedly died after being shot at a campaign event yesterday. This according to NHK, yesterday, our time, of course. A suspect was arrested moments after the attack, and it appears that the firearm was homemade. Of course, there are incredibly few firearm deaths in Japan. It has one of the strictest gun control policies in the Western world. Joining us now for the latest from Tokyo is Geroid Rady, who covers Japan for Bloomberg Opinion. Geroid, what do we know about the possibility that this prime minister has died? He is the longest serving prime minister in a post-war Japan.
How you doing? Well, certainly he was the longest-serving prime minister until his shock resignation a couple of years ago. NHK is reporting, citing, I should say, senior LDP executives that he is indeed, he has been confirmed dead. I do believe the hospital where he was being treated is holding a press conference right as we speak. Of course, if that's true, it's an absolutely shocking turn of events in a country that, as you say, has very little gun violence, and it's certainly very little gun violence towards, you know, national figures such as Abe. It truly is one of the most shocking days that I can remember in all my time covering Japan.
Upper house elections this Sunday. Do we think they're going to go ahead?
What we're hearing so far from senior cabinet ministers is that that they want them to go ahead. They say they're not going to be cowed into changing the plans, and certainly that democracy would suffer if they change the plans as a result of this. They spoke before. Abe was reported to have been pronounced dead, so we will see, I think, how things go ahead. My suspicion would be that, given what we know about the suspect, and given that it does appear to be an individual who has been arrested, I would suspect that the elections will go ahead as planned.
And what about economic policy in Japan? Is there any reason to believe that once Abe is gone, that will change, that the legacy of Abenomics is going to be a thing of the past?
Very difficult to tell, I think, at this point in time. Prime Minister Kishida had certainly carried on a number of aspects of Abenomics, but he had already been pushing towards his own form of economic policy, what he calls his new capitalism. Whether this will have any impact on that or potentially make it more difficult to undo some of the things that Abe did, I think we'll really have to wait and see, you know, until we know a little bit more.
All right, Bloomberg's Garrod Reedy reporting on this breaking news from Tokyo. Thank you so much. We'll have more throughout the hour. Again, NHK reporting that Japan's longest-serving Premier Shinzo Abe has died after being shot at an event earlier today. He was 67 years old. Now, heading over to Washington, earlier the White House had weighed in on this event, saying, quote, "We are shocked and saddened to hear about the violent attack against former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. We are closely monitoring the reports and keeping our thoughts with his family and the people of Japan." Meanwhile, the administration is also looking elsewhere in Asia, nearing a decision on trade with China. Bloomberg has learned that President Biden will meet with advisors today about rolling back tariffs on Chinese goods. Emily Wilkins, Bloomberg government reporter, joins us now from Farmington Hills, Michigan, for the details. So, Emily, is this just another way the administration is trying to be seen, trying to do something about inflation?
Absolutely, Kaylee. I mean, inflation still remains really the #1 issue for the Biden administration right now when it comes to what's going to impact the upcoming midterms, as well as just day-to-day quality for Americans. But there's really a question about exactly how much this move could potentially help Americans feeling some of that price pressure. I mean, this could impact a number of products coming over from China, chips, appliances, apparel, but it's not going to impact things like gas, like food. That's where Americans are really feeling the price pressure right now. At the same point, there is a chance that the U.S. is headed for a recession, and you have heard Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo saying that this could be something that would at least slightly ease pressure from Americans at this point.
Emily, why are you in Michigan?
So, as you know, there is a midterm coming up. That's not till November, but primaries are being decided right now. Michigan has a particularly interesting one. You've got two Democratic incumbents, Haley Stevens and Andy Levin, that are going up against each other. It's going to be a very interesting primary in terms of sort of what people are thinking of as the future of the Democratic Party, what Democrats really need to do to make sure that they are successful in the next several years. So that primary is coming up on August 2nd, but wanted to get on the ground. And also speaking with folks, it's an interesting area. You know, this is very much automotive manufacturing, the automotive industry. And I've talked with a number of people who have said that their jobs have been impacted because of delays with the supply chain and a lack of chips and other parts for automobiles.
All right, Emily Wilkins of Bloomberg Government, thank you so much. Of course, the economy, a huge factor in those midterm elections. So let's talk more about that. Federal Reserve officials are playing down the risk of a recession while making the case for another 75 basis point hike this month. Fed Governor Chris Waller and St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard both spoke yesterday.
If we don't get the inflation under control, inflation expectations could become unmoored.
We need to move to a much more restrictive setting in terms of interest rates and policy. And we need to do that as quickly as possible. I'm definitely in support of doing another 75 basis point hike in July.
Those remarks, of course, come ahead of the U.S. jobs report out today at 8:30 a.m. New York time. Michael McKee, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent, joins us now with more from what to expect from the data. So 268,000 is the estimate?
That's the estimate, and the question is, how does the bond market read it? Because the Fed guys are saying we're overheating. The bond market is saying we're going into recession. Here's the numbers we're expecting, as Kaylee says, 268,000. Now, that seems like a big come down from where we were, but that is going to be the only the lowest since 2019. And so it is a pretty good number. 488,000 has been the average so far, but in the 2 years leading up to the pandemic, it was only 184. So that's still very strong. 3.6, we're not expecting to move down from there, but if we do, that could be amazing, because at this point, 3.6 is the lowest since 2019. You have to go back to 1969 to get below that at 3.4. The 5.2% is a year-over-year basis in terms of what we're looking at for average hourly earnings. And the thing you want to watch here really is the monthly number. It's been 0.3 for the last 2 months. The Fed doesn't want to see that go up. And the participation rate, if that continues to tick up, that's good news. If it doesn't, and we get a lot of jobs, this number, unemployment, is going to go down. So are we in recession? Well, this number will give us, today's number will give us some idea of what's going on. The SOM rule is something that a lot of people at the Fed follow. It suggests you have to rise 0.5 percentage point to get into a recession. The unemployment rate has to rise. And that's what's happened in all these recessions prior to this, except look where we are today. We are not anywhere near that kind of increase. So the Fed's going to tell you we're not in recession, but at 8:31 this morning, the bond market's going to give us their own vote. Absolutely. Fascinating number. Can't wait to see what happens here a little bit later on. We're all on tenterhooks. Mike McKee, thank you very much indeed. And as a result, we've got some great coverage coming up. We've got an interview with the Labour Secretary, Marty Walsh. That's going to follow the delivery of the jobs report. That interview, 9:40 a.m. New York time, 2:40 p.m. here in London. Let's turn to British politics now. Boris Johnson plans to remain as the UK's caretaker Prime Minister, but those plans are under increasing pressure. The ruling Conservative Party is seeking to accelerate the contest to choose his successor by the end of the summer. He made his resignation statement yesterday.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I've agreed with Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of our backbench MPs, that the process of choosing that new leader should begin now. And the timetable will be announced next week. And I've today appointed a cabinet to serve, as I will, until a new leader is in place.
Are we going to see an accelerated process? We're joined now from Westminster by Bloomberg UK reporter Lizzie Burden. Lizzie, let's talk about the process, how quickly it could happen, and who are now the front runners in that race.
Well, Guy, it's a wide open race at the moment, but the bookies' favourites so far are Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, the ex-Defence Secretary, and Tom Tugendhat, who has military experience but hasn't had a senior cabinet role. He's trying to play that to his advantage, spinning it as his distance from Boris Johnson and the scandals that brought the Prime Minister down. But of course, military experience highly prized in this moment from all of them because of the war in Ukraine. The other big issue in the UK at the moment, the cost of living crisis, that could play to the ex-Chancellor Rishi Sunak, though his reputation's somewhat in rehabilitation mode at the moment because of the debacle over his wife's tax affairs, his involvement in Partygate. So some might look to the new Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi. He's signalled that he'd be perhaps more open to tax cuts, which could appeal to the Tory core. Whoever they pick, Guy, the Conservatives say that they're going to try to whittle it down to 2 names by July the 21st, pick a new leader by September, but even that is far too long for many of them to leave Boris Johnson in Downing Street because the Conservatives are plunging in the polls compared to the Labour Party.
All right, Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden, thank you so much for your great reporting over the last couple of days. Now to another story we have our eye on this morning. Elon Musk's $44 billion deal for Twitter is in jeopardy and may fall apart over his doubts that the company is accurately reporting the number of spam bots on the service. The Washington Post reporting yesterday that Musk's team has concluded that Twitter can't verify its figures on the spam accounts and has, quote, stopped engaging in discussions around funding the deal. So that is having an impact on Twitter shares in pre-market trading this morning. They're down by about 4%, trading right around $37 a share, which is $17 below Elon Musk's offer price of $54.20. Another stock that is moving lower is GameStop, the company firing its CFO and cutting other jobs, really trying to shift as demand in the gaming space shifts as well. That stock is down about 6%. Before the bell. Finally, I also wanted to check on one group of stocks, really the ARK Innovation ETF, of course, tracks a bundle of them, but it really is the poster child for growth, for risk. It has not done well this year, down about 50% year to date, but it was up about 13.6% on the week this week coming into today, as we've seen a little bit of a rebound rally in some of those names. However, it's giving some of that back this morning, Guy, down about 1.7% before the bell.
We'll keep an eye on what is happening there. Coming up, NHK is reporting that the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has died. Tina Barrett, Associate Professor of Political Science at Sophia University in Tokyo, will join us next. We're also going to hear a little bit later on what is happening here in Europe. We'll get some analysis from Jochen Fels, Global Economic Advisor at PIMCO. That's all coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Japanese now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the House for business's greatest minds. Today, June jobs are in focus.
I think we're all very curious how June jobs came in.
The labor market is tremendously strong.
We have never been in a recession with declining unemployment.
Today, the surveillance team will bring you crucial data and expert analysis at terminal speed.
There's so much uncertainty. We're going to have to monitor the data closely.
Everyone needs to recalibrate at 8:31 a.m. this Friday.
The June Jobs Report, today on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Guy Johnson in London. Matt Miller and Kayleigh Lyons both over in New York. Anna Edwards is off today. So the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has died, this after being shot at a campaign event. We're getting a briefing now from the doctor that has treated him, indicating that Abe was in a grave condition when he arrived at hospital and that he suffered a small gunshot wound to the right of his neck. Finance Minister Suzuki has also been speaking, saying it's hard to believe such a thing could happen in Japan. Joining us now for analysis, Tina Barrett, Associate Professor of Political Science at Sophia University in Tokyo. Tina, shocking news from Japan. What are the implications?
Well, I think for a society where gun crime is very low, this is a really shocking incident. Made the more shocking, I think, for a lot of people in Japan by the fact that the gun seems to have been homemade. And this makes people, I think, feel more afraid than they would ordinarily, because guns are very difficult to get your hands on in Japan. But the fact that an individual can make a gun, I think, is something that's quite news to individuals in Japan. And so this is sort of creating an exacerbated sense of shock in the country right now.
Abe was a huge figure in Japan. What do you think his legacy will ultimately be?
Yeah, I mean, he was the longest post-war serving prime minister in Japanese history. He is a figure, I think, who's internationally recognized, which is not something we can say about a lot of Japanese figures. And I think he really did bring more attention to Japan globally. He formed good relationships with a lot of international partners, other leaders. So that element of his policy and his legacy, I think, is something that people in Japan universally are proud of. Otherwise, he was quite a controversial figure domestically, in particular in terms of his defense policy and his more assertive stance on defense issues. For example, reinterpreting Japan's pacifist constitution, some of his laws around security, for example, secrecy laws, which made it more difficult, for example, for journalists to talk to whistleblowers. So Abe is, I think, a big figure in Japanese politics, but his legacy is quite a complicated one.
I don't think it helps at all to speculate as to why he was assassinated, but I do want to focus in on the controversy that you just brought up, in the sense that, we're at a point where Germany is now beefing up its military in response to a more aggressive Russia. Isn't it appropriate that Japan now 75 years later, starts to build up its own military in response to a more aggressive China?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the nub of the controversy. Some people in Japan think absolutely we live in a much more dangerous world, a much more dangerous region, with China building up its own military and the antagonism around the Senkaku Islands, that dispute that exists with China. But on the other hand, some people see Japan's more assertive defense policy as being antagonistic towards countries like China, especially in combination with Abe's sort of symbolic gestures, like visiting controversial sites in Tokyo connected to the Second World War, places that have historical resonance for Korea and Japan and China as well. So I think we see a very divided country when it comes to what's the right course of action regarding defense policy.
Will Japan continue to strengthen its sovereignty post-Abe, or does this change anything politically?
I think in that sense, probably not a great deal will change. And we've already seen Prime Minister Kishida in the past year really asserting his independence from Abe, who I think thought after his ally Kishida became Prime Minister that he would still be pulling some of the strings behind and be a bit of sort of kingpin within the LDP. And that hasn't really happened. We've seen Kishida really following quite his own line of policies. So I think Abe's influence over politics was already waning. So I don't see there being actually that much change based on his now sad departure from the political scene.
What about his influence over monetary policy? Because to some extent, Abe saw the Bank of Japan as somewhat of an extension of the Japanese government. And I'm wondering how that relationship may change if there no longer is Abe to support Kuroda and the decisions that he's making.
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably is something that we're going to have to watch in the next few days. But as I say, I think Prime Minister Kishida has been his own person regarding his policies, certainly since winning a general election victory in October last year. So I don't think necessarily that this is going to signal a huge amount of change vis-a-vis monetary policy or really many other policies.
And the elections on Sunday, does this have any influence in the outcome?
I mean, I think we might see some sympathy votes for the LDP, and Prime Minister Kishida's popularity, which has actually been reasonably high for a Japanese Prime Minister, has waned a little bit in recent weeks. This may give a bit of a boost to his party, since he and former Prime Minister Abe are members of the same political party. But I also think Japanese citizens are, they're grown-ups. They can distinguish between this tragedy that's happened today and also the election, which is about different issues. It's mainly going to be about inflation, cost of living, and these kinds of issues, as we're seeing across the globe, elections being about these kinds of topics.
All right, thank you so much to Tina Burritt, Associate Professor of Political Science at Sophia University in Tokyo. Of course, to reiterate, we now have confirmation that former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, has died after a gunshot wound to the neck earlier this morning when he was shot at a campaign event in Nara. Abe, of course, had 2 terms as the Japanese Prime Minister, making him the longest serving, the first term being from 2006 to 2007, then again from 2012 to 2020, which is, of course, when Abenomics was introduced, the idea that they will ease monetary policy, boost fiscal spending, all trying to get Japan out of decades of stagnation and deflation. That Abenomics legacy, of course, is one that will continue to live on. But again, after being shot at a campaign event earlier today, Japanese former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has died at the age of 67.
It's almost the end of the year, but Bali is still quiet and empty. I am here in Kuta Legian, one of the main walking streets here that is used to be a tourist spot for beach, dining, shopping, but many shops here are still closed. Most of the outlets are either for rent or for sale as they have run out of business.
Saya kerjanya di sini udah lama, udah ada 10 tahunan di sini kerja. Masih sepi sih, nggak kayak dulu. Kalau dulu kan rame, sekarang ya ada 1-2 itu ada, tapi nggak kayak dulu. Kalau dulu rame sekali. Sekarang paling dapat jualan ya 100, 120 gitu, 200 ya. Kalau dulu sih ya nyampe dah 1 juta, 1,5 tuh nyampe dapat jualan. Bisa sampai 2 juta dulu. Sekarang nggak pernah lagi dapat segitu. Sama aja. Belum ada turis ke Bali. Masih ya domestik aja.
While Bali has reopened its borders for foreign tourists since October, they're still not coming in. Many international airlines are yet to reinstate their direct flight to the island. Balinese people here really hope they can see more people from Australia, China, and Europe to come visit next year.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, the early edition, and this is what you need to know. The former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has died after being shot at a campaign event. It is stunning news in a country where political violence and guns are rare. A suspect has been arrested. Abe was 67 and was Japan's longest-serving Prime Minister. Federal Reserve hawks are still pushing for a 75 basis point hike this month to fight inflation. Both Chris Waller and James Bullard are downplaying fears the U.S. economy is heading for a recession. Today's U.S. jobs report will be a likely factor in that central bank decision. And Boris Johnson is pressed to make a quicker exit from number 10 Downing Street. The Conservative Party wants to choose his successor by the end of the summer. The Prime Minister's office has floated a 3-month timetable. It did so yesterday. I'm Guy Johnson in London, Matt Miller and Katie Lyons in New York. Anna Edwards is off today. Matt, set us up for the U.S. markets.
Well, it's important to point out that a lot of times traders will wait until these big numbers come out, like a non-farm payrolls number or a Fed decision, before they make serious moves. Nonetheless, we do see a bit of a sell-off in futures right now, down a little less than 0.5%, and investors are buying the 10-year bond, pushing the yield down just over 1 basis point to 298.16. We have had a decent week in the cash trade to set us up for this, so possibly some profit-taking going on. It is interesting to watch NYMEX crude. We've been bouncing back and forth between gains and losses. There have been concerns about, obviously, the supply. It's difficult to see that much spare capacity coming out. On the other hand, we've had recession concerns. So we've been pushed down below 100. Right now, we're back up above it at 102.11 for a barrel of Texas Intermediate. And Bitcoin is off just a bit, this number from midnight, but it's been a good week for Bitcoin. We're up to 21,502, and that's definitely something to watch. Kaylee, what do you see in terms of the U.S. pre-market movers?
Well, there's a lot of them moving lower today. No surprise given the broader risk-off sentiment, but there is some more idiosyncrasies we have to focus on as well, like for GameStop, which fired its CFO and is now cutting employees as well as it tries to adjust to shifting demand in the video game space. It's down about 7% before the bell. And of course, the other news we got overnight yesterday was that report out of the Washington Post that Elon Musk's $44 billion deal to buy Twitter is in jeopardy due to that whole bots issue that he's really worried about. Apparently, Musk and his team are no longer even engaging in discussions around the funding of the deal. So Twitter is down about 4% at $37.15 a share at the moment. Of course, the offer price was $54.20. Meanwhile, Tesla also is down about 1.3%. But that may have more to do with the fact that we're seeing some of those tech stocks that have done really well so far this week giving back some of those gains this morning, and that includes Apple, down about 0.7% before the bell, Guy.
Kelly, European stocks are just drifting into that payroll number. To be honest, there's nothing to see here. Yesterday, a good session. The focus is elsewhere. Euro dollar, we are firmly on parity watch. We are approaching that number. The payroll number could push us through parity. Pay attention a little bit later on. But I think the real story in Europe surrounds what is happening in the energy markets. European electricity prices are shooting higher once again today. We are seeing nat gas coming down a touch. Remember, Monday, Nord Stream 1 is turned off for maintenance. That's the huge gas pipeline that comes out of Russia into Germany. Gas prices are up on the week. This is the pivotal story for Europe. We don't know. You cannot predict what the economic outcome in Europe is going to be until you can answer the question, will the gas stay on or will it be turned off? Will there be enough gas going into winter is critical, but electricity prices are doing damage right now. We see German yields coming lower today, and again, that is a reflection of the reality of what is happening on the continent right now, Kaylee.
Absolutely. Well, let's focus on another continent for a moment. The news out of Asia, specifically Japan, overnight that the former prime minister, the longest-serving prime minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, has been killed, assassinated earlier after being shot at a campaign event, dead at the age of 67. Let's get more on his legacy, his economic legacy in particular. Joachim Fels, global economic advisor at PIMCO, joins us now. Joachim, just your reaction to the events of this morning and how Japan is different today than before Abenomics took over.
Yeah, so very sad news, obviously, Kaylee. I think Shinzo Abe's legacy is very much alive. When he was prime minister, he was the architect of a policy of combined monetary fiscal stimulus to overcome deflation. And I think his legacy will be that this actually helped to lift Japan out of deflation. So the Bank of Japan strategy of yield curve control, which is still in place and which is, I think, under review at the moment, that really helped to get us out of deflation, and the government helped under Abe by pursuing a expansionary fiscal policy. So I think this is what will remain.
Well, you speak of the Bank of Japan's yield curve control, and obviously the markets have been pressuring them potentially to change that, in that we still have a Japanese yen right around its weakest level since 1998, even before the time of Abe. And I'm wondering whether you see a coming change from the Bank of Japan and if his death may accelerate that change at all.
I think the policy will change eventually. My guess is that Governor Kuroda, BOJ Governor Kuroda, will want to hand over to his successor a slight change in the policy. It's always easier if the outgoing governor initiates those changes. There are two options, I think, that the BOJ will be considering over the next few months. One is to raise the cap on 10-year JGB yields, currently 25 basis points. So this may be raised to 50 or even 75 basis points. The other option is to move the cap from the 10-year sector of the yield curve down to the 5-year sector. In both cases, this would allow a further steepening of the Japanese yield curve, and that is something that will help Japanese financial institutions and could therefore support the recovery. Also, this could stop the weakening of the yen, which I think is now starting to become a concern in Japan because it's putting strong upward pressure on input prices.
If they raise the cap, Joachim, is that going to be jarring for financial markets? Something like when the Swiss National Bank dropped the peg on the franc?
I think it may not be as strong a signal for markets as when the SNB changed the FX intervention, Matt. But yes, I think this could put some upward pressure on global yields, given the importance of the yen carry trade for global fixed income markets. So this is perhaps the last shoe to drop, the last shoe we still need to see to drop before becoming more confident that we have seen the peak for global yields.
Jochen, I find it hard to predict what is going to happen in the second half of the year without having a full understanding of whether or not Europe is going to end up in stagnation. We could find ourselves in a situation where gas is turned off by the Russians. We have Nord Stream 1 going into maintenance Monday. It should be out for 10 days. We don't know. Electricity prices are already shooting to the moon. They are going to do significant damage economically at these levels. How on earth do I come up with a reasonable kind of prediction for global growth if I don't know the answer to that question?
Yeah, I think you're right, Guy. This is incredibly hard at the moment because I think a lot depends on factors that are almost impossible to forecast. So will the gas be turned off? What's the further path for food prices, for energy prices overall? So right now, I think we are in this twilight zone between stagflation. That's how I would characterize the current situation. Inflation too high, activity too low and slowing. So we're in this twilight zone between stagflation and recession. Really hard to say how it ends. My guess is eventually we will end up in what will hopefully be a relatively mild recession. In the US, by the way, we may already be in recession on some of those indicators, like 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. Europe is still lagging a little bit behind because we still see the effects of the reopening of the economy in the service sector, so strong demand for services, for travel, and so on. But obviously, high energy prices, high inflation is biting. It is eating into real disposable incomes.
Yeah.
So I think a recession is quite likely over the next 3 to 6 months, both in the US and in Europe.
Well, Joachim, your words are a stark contrast to what we're hearing out of Federal Reserve officials. Christopher Waller, Jim Bullard yesterday, both playing down the risk of a recession, saying they want to move 75 basis points again this month. How could the job numbers we see later on today inform whether that move in a couple weeks is actually one of 75 basis points?
So I don't think the job numbers will have a big impact on the Fed's decision. I think the Fed is now really out to kill inflation. It took them a long time to, get to this stance, but I think it's quite likely they do 75 at the next meeting, irrespective of what the job numbers later today will bring. I think the Fed currently is entirely focused on inflation. The dual mandate has become a single mandate for now. I think they're even willing to risk a recession, at least a mild recession, to bring inflation down, because at 8.6% and possibly soon 9% headline CPI inflation, that's really the thing that matters. And I think they all remember an old saying amongst central bankers, which is that only hawks get to go to central banker heaven.
Yeah, that must sound like a fun place. Jochen, thank you very much indeed. Jochen Fels of PIMCO, thank you very much. Coming up, Tobias Harris, Senior Fellow for Asia at the Center for American Progress. We'll, of course, be talking about the implications of the assassination of Shinzo Abe. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Crypto You have a world of young people that want their own financial system and their own culture. And it is very powerful, and I'm a big believer in it.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Kaylee Lyons with Matt Miller in New York and Guy Johnson in London. Anna Edwards is off today. And Guy, Matt, we thought we would be focusing today on the jobs report coming out of the U.S. at 8:30 a.m. Eastern time, but instead we all have been rocked by the news out of Japan that former Prime Minister, the longest-serving Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, has died at the age of 67 after being shot at a campaign event. It is stunning news in a country where political violence and guns are rare. Tobias Harris, Senior Fellow for Asia at the Center for American Progress, joins us now. Tobias, just please, your reaction to the events of this morning and how it could shape Japan going forward.
It's absolutely stunning. I mean, from the moment that the news broke that in a routine campaign appearance that former Prime Minister Abe was shot and in critical condition, it's just been absolutely stunning. And he was, I think, at the moment of his death, I mean, he was the most powerful politician in Japan, even as a former prime minister. I mean, he wielded tremendous influence, and certainly politically, his death leaves, I think, a considerable power vacuum, and it's not exactly clear how that will be filled.
In terms of the more immediate effects, we have elections coming up Sunday. Do you think there will be a ripple from what has happened here into voting?
Well, I mean, I think, the LDP Komeito ruling coalition was already heading towards what looked like an easy victory in all polls. And so I think the only question is going to be is if you were to get some sort of sympathy vote that increased turnout and maybe made the LDP's victory bigger. I mean, I think it looked like it was going to be a stretch for the LDP to win a majority of its own. Maybe this changes the equation on that front. That, I think certainly there might be some sort of sympathy vote. I think, I think across the political spectrum, I think people are shocked by something like this. You have not seen anything remotely like this in maybe more than 60 years. But really, I mean, given how stable and placid Japanese politics has been, this kind of event is just, I mean, it's almost unthinkable.
Are there policy implications? There was discussion within the market a little bit earlier on talking about the idea that if the LDP did better, that would allow maybe the government to take the pressure off the BOJ when it comes to fighting inflation, dealing with inflation. That could be one impact that could feed through into financial markets. Are there obvious lines that you can progress in terms of arguments around how this could shape policy?
It's really hard to say because it could cut a number of different ways. I mean, Abe was a major voice, of course, in favor of much more defense spending, of a much more assertive defense posture, and also basically also in favor of considerably more deficit spending to pay for more defense spending. And so his voice, absent from those debates, maybe changes things. But on the other hand, it's possible that the LDP is going to unify around what Abe believed and really push to get done what he wanted in these upcoming debates. And so, I mean, it's really too early to say exactly how that's going to shake out. And certainly, it changes, I think, the immediate political landscape for Prime Minister Kishida, who I think ever since he became Prime Minister, he's had to be engaged in this delicate dance with Abe, whose support was critical for him winning. But on the other hand, Abe had very strong opinions about what Kishida should do. And now, absent that pressure from Abe, it's not exactly clear what preferences of Kishida's own will win out in these debates.
Is it time? Abe was at the forefront, really, of this move away from a pacifist stance towards a more assertive stance in terms of Japan's sovereignty and in terms of the threat that China has proved. Is it time now, especially after what we've seen in Germany, for post-war Japan to start building up a strong military power of its own?
Well, what's remarkable is that we've seen probably more change in terms of building a public consensus around Japan spending more on defense and maybe even just being more assertive in its posture since the Ukraine war began than we have, I think, after decades of agitation by conservatives like Abe and his allies, which goes to show, I think, that there's something particularly resonant about the images that have come out of Ukraine, watching people huddle in the Kyiv subway in the early days of the war and the impact, people living under rocket fire. And I think that's made a very strong impression on the Japanese public. And it also suggests that the Japanese public might be more comfortable with that kind of policy change under someone like Kishida, who has sold himself as a liberal dove, as opposed to someone like Abe, who was, a very assertive hawk, and I think made people uncomfortable with his zeal for that kind of change. And so in some ways, the obstacles, the barriers that I think you saw to that kind of policy shift in the past are certainly lower now than they had been.
Sum up for us the legacy that Shinzo Abe leaves behind. I mean, he comes from such an historically important family, even in terms of serving in government. I think his brother is still the vice minister for foreign affairs. And his wife has been a vocal opponent of a lot of his policies. This is really kind of a political dynasty, isn't it?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, he knew that he was carrying a dynasty forward into the future, and really committed to the idea that Japan needs to be a leading power in the world, in the first rank of nations. And in some ways, he did not fully achieve what he wanted. I think Japan still has, a pretty grim demographic outlook. It's hard to say that it's fully left behind the stagnation of the past. Clearly it has challenges, but I think in terms of creating a Japan that was confident enough to act as a leader globally and regionally, I certainly think he developed a blueprint that he pursued in power, and then his successors have followed as well. And for Japan being an assertive leader when it comes to trade talks, when it comes to strengthening relations with its neighbors, when it comes to having a strong alliance with the United States, all of those things he was committed to and delivered on in office. And I think it's very hard to imagine his successors deviating from that. I mean, he really has laid down a set of policies that I think, as I think Abe was fond of saying, that there is no alternative to what he offered.
Tobias Harris, thank you for the analysis. We greatly appreciate it. Tobias Harris, Senior Fellow for Asia at the Center for American Progress. Thank you very much indeed. We'll continue the conversation and discuss further this man's legacy. Shocking news today, the assassination of Shinzo Abe, 1954 to 2022.
the Delhi airport, and behind me you can see SpiceJet 737 MAX aircraft. Earlier today said that Boeing is going to compensate SpiceJet in form of cash and aircraft. There's a big celebration happening at the Gwalior airport. As you can see, they've literally rolled down the red carpet for SpiceJet chairman Ajay Singh. There are balloons, there are flowers. This is a big deal for SpiceJet because it is the only Indian operator of Boeing 737 MAX planes currently.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller in New York with Guy Johnson in London. We want to go live now to Nara, Japan, where former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was shot and killed. Bloomberg's Kurumi Mori is there. She just attended the presser by the Nara Medical University, or at the Nara Medical University Hospital. Kurumi, tell us what we know about what transpired earlier today in Japan.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just inside the room where the hospital president and the ER doctor in charge of treating Abe just spoke to the press. Dr. Fukushima mostly did most of the talking during this press. And he told us that he was able to stop the major bleeding when former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe arrived at the hospital. But by then, it was too much blood was lost. A bullet had pierced Abe's neck and heart in 2 places. He had died about 3 hours of being in surgery, unfortunately declared dead at 5:03 p.m. local time here. Of course, very upsetting news. I'm walking around the campus now. I had left the presser. There's another building where the emergency services staff is, and I just took a peek inside. There's Secret Service just lining the halls, presumably towards Shinzo Abe's room. We saw Akiya Abe, his wife, of course, had arrived at the hospital just a short while ago. So again, of course, the assassination sending a huge shock throughout Japan.
Kurumi, can you talk to us about how much protection he had? How did this happen?
Yeah, that's the question we are all asking right now. We're seeing a lot of security officials, of course, now at the hospital, walking around, checking everybody. But during the actual incident, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was near the train station and he was campaigning for the upcoming upper house elections. Now, this is pretty common. Notable politicians like Abe go on the road to rally support for candidates leading up to elections. But there is hardly much security there. I mean, of course, he had his security officials, but you could get quite close to these politicians on the ground. So we are still learning more and more about how this exactly happened.
Kurumi, thank you very much indeed for the updates. Kurumi Mori joining us from Japan. Matt, that's the story we've been focusing on. We're going to focus later on what is happening, of course, with the jobs picture. Euro dollar, I have to say, trading 101.20. Maybe we go through parity later on.
Yeah, and it's been below 101 today. We are obviously going to be focused on the jobs number as we are every month, but I think it's interesting that Joachim Fels said he doesn't think the jobs number is going to have a big impact on the Fed's decision because they're already slotted in for a 75 basis point hike. That's it for Surveillance Early Edition.
When you think of cutting-edge technology at sea, you might be thinking of stuff like this. But there's an incoming revolution on the high seas that isn't quite as sexy, but could be significantly more impactful.
Container shipping is the key component of global trade. About 80 or 90% of all the world's goods are transported at sea at some point.
But there's a significant unseen cost to the modern era of global commerce.
About 3% of all the world's CO2 emissions come from shipping.
3% may not sound like a lot, but that's roughly comparable to the entire CO2 output of Germany. Since reducing trade isn't a likely option, what about a technological improvement to help reduce the emissions from these well-stocked maritime behemoths?
Inflation. I think it's been clear by the Fed that that is their target.
I think they've already likely gone too far.
If the Fed feels they can't slow down from that 75 per meeting pace, that's really going to clobber the economy.
My view is that the Fed blinks. The U.S. might not be in a recession and may be on the cusp of a recession.
We're not looking at, the Volcker recession of the early 1980s.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Live from New York City for our audience worldwide. Good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on TV and radio. Alongside Tom Keene, I'm Jonathan Farrow, together this morning with Katie Lyons. Bramo back in the seat next week. Futures down by about 1/3% on the S&P. TK, we have to begin with heartbreaking news out of Japan.
Crushing. I can see the Prime Minister, as we speak, absolutely shattered off on one of my feeds here. John will go to Enda Curran here in a moment. I'm hoping to speak with Robert Feldman of Morgan Stanley. We'll see on that. John, this is a tragic loss for the domestic people of Japan. My first message this morning, John, is this is not about that acclaimed phrase, Abenomics. This is about a family that spans Japan from the recovery out of World War II.
Tom, getting reaction from around the world. Japan's Prime Minister saying this a little bit earlier. It is a barbaric act that took place during the election, which is the base of democracy. It is absolutely unforgivable.
When you look at what he accomplished, it goes very much, John, to domestic politics. His grandfather was a Class A war criminal of the United States of America, became Prime Minister of Japan in the 50s, and the grandson followed on to amend and soften the harsh militaristic rhetoric of the alt-right of Japan. He paid that price this morning.
Kaylee, you caught up with Joachim Fowles of PIMCO a little bit earlier this morning. And in his words, and I wrote them down, his legacy is very much alive.
Yeah, the idea that Abenomics is going to live on, that you are still seeing a continuation of these economic policies in Japan as we speak. For all of the tightening we talk about elsewhere in the world, policy in Japan still easy. They are still trying to stimulate an economy that for so long has struggled with the idea of deflation in stagnation. And of course, Abe, during his time at Prime Minister from 2012 to just about 2 years ago, John, that was one of his primary goals.
We will, of course, stay on top of the latest news out of Tokyo, Japan, throughout this morning on Bloomberg TV and on Bloomberg Radio. If you're just waking up this morning and looking for some price action, I'll whip through that for you as well. Just briefly, futures are negative 1/3% on the S&P 500. On the NASDAQ 100, we're down about 0.4%. That's not the story of the week. The story of the week so far is 4 days of gains. On the S&P 500, we had a fourth yesterday, the longest winning streak going back to March. Yields in by a couple of basis points to 297.24, call it 297.50. Katie, all of that going into payrolls a few hours away.
A few hours away, but before we can even get there, John, we also are going to hear from another central banker in Europe. Christine Lagarde will be speaking at the Aix-en-Provence conference, the French Davos, later on at 7:55 a.m. Eastern Time. Yes, I'm interested in what she has to say about the July meeting. Is 25 basis points still the case she wants to make? What about that anti-fragmentation tool? But maybe more interestingly today, what does she have to say about a euro at its weakest level since 2002? Once again, we find ourselves on parity watch with euro dollar trading at 101.24 this morning. As for that payrolls report you mentioned, John, 268,000 non-farm payrolls added in the month of June is what we're expecting to see, along with an unemployment rate of 3.6% and wage growth of about 5% year on year. But John, the question really is going to be, is there anything in these numbers that alters the case for the Fed? Because we continually hear the focus is on inflation, less so on this labor market. Is that the message we will hear post-jobs at 11 a.m. Eastern Time from New York Fed President John Williams, who of course will be speaking after we heard from Waller and Bullard yesterday, both making the case for another 75 basis point move, playing down the risk of recession. Is that a similar message that we'll get later this morning,
And
John?
Bullard talking up the potential for a soft landing as well. Kelly, thank you. Great to have you with us through this morning. Tom, just looking ahead to this payrolls print, Citi and Andrew Hollenhorst have really led the way when it comes to expecting a hawkish Fed. This is what they have to say going into the payrolls print. A solid 290K jobs number with upside risk to wage growth could be the next catalyst to price out the near-term recession narrative and price back in a confident pace of Fed hikes into 2023.
This is the heart of the matter. It's been voiced, say, by Jan Hatzius, I think, very cogently at Goldman Sachs as well, but many, many others, John. Do we have a strong economy, as Chairman Powell talks about? And at 8:30, you know, my phrase is you go beneath the headline data. Well, okay, maybe so, but maybe this is the jobs report where the headline data really matters.
And Tom, starting to see some pockets of weakness, not in the headline data in the labour market, but elsewhere perhaps. We had that weak ISM last week, just looking at the orders component of it. Looking at the employment component of this week's ISM, Mike McKee very keen to point out that within that data point, they talked about the supply side story, not so much about the demand, Tom. Are we still in a supply-constrained economy? And most economists, Tom, would tell you we are.
Well, that's going to be the debate. I think there's going to be a lot of activity over the weekend, John. I know you're already sliding into the weekend already after returning from Washington, but many others aren't. They're going to work through the weekend to recalibrate off of this jobs report, and it is a recalibration off the supply shock guess and, frankly, the demand mystery that's out there.
TK, what do you make of the bond market move, just briefly? We've creeped higher this week by 9 basis points, 297, just south of 3% again. Bit of curve inversion still out there.
I'm going to steal a phrase from Peter Bernstein and maybe Douglas North at Washington University, St. Louis. The ambiguity is knee-deep, John. I mean, the ambiguity right now on the Bloomberg screen is extraordinary. I would point out dollar strength as being a resilient feature this week.
That's the main event for the market that will take place at 8:30 Eastern Time. Looking forward to that jobs print. We begin, of course, this morning with a top story out of Tokyo, Japan, and we can catch up with someone very special to us. It's Enda Curran, our Chief Asia Economics Correspondent. Enda, let's just begin with the sad news out of Japan, the death of the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Can you help all of us understand just what we've woken up to? What happened?
Well, it's obviously completely shocking news, Jonathan. And, you know, it's been described as one of those days that will leave deep scars on the Japanese community for a long time. As you know, the details are scant somewhat, but he was canvassing for the upper house elections. He seemed to have been attacked by somebody and died from the gunshot wounds that he received. Now, that's going to reverberate both through Japan's economy, because obviously he pioneered the extraordinary policy of Abenomics, huge government spending, huge central bank support that, while it had mixed success, some credited for at least reviving the Japanese stock market and at least boosting growth to some extent before the pandemic came along. And then, of course, to the global stage. Abe really put Japan back on the global stage. He was seen as a foreign policy hawk. He tried to mend ties with China, while also, of course, boosting spending on Japan's own military, or easing restrictions on Japan's military, and trying to boost ties with key powers right around the world. So it's hard to understate the shock this will have, both for Japan's domestic politics and for Japan's people, and Japan's standing on the global stage.
And I'm seeing here on my feed into the Bloomberg headquarters here in New York, Mr. Kishida finishing his remarks in the dark of night in Tokyo. And Curran, all of the arc of the political dynasty of the Abe family goes back to September 2nd of 1945 in an arch debate in Japan of how to reassert any form of military presence. Abe had the courage to hold off the ultra-nationalists. Did he pay for it this morning?
Well, he certainly he tried to strike a balance in his policy, both his defence and foreign policy with Japan, Tom, because like you mentioned, on the one hand, he had to deal with calls at home to bolster Japan's hawkish foreign policy, to give the military a bigger role, and to some extent he did that. But he was also credited, of course, with mending relations with China, and those relations with China had come a long way until, of course, the Hong Kong issue more or less skewered that progress. And then, of course, the pandemic also upended a lot of what Abe was trying to do, both on the global stage and back at home, in terms of what he was trying to do with the economy, leaving him with something of a mixed legacy on both counts. But I think the big takeaway for Abe will be his hawkish foreign policy on the global stage. And especially, by the way, after office, he was especially vocal in recent months in terms of China's role in the Pacific and what Japan's role should be in that as well. So he did strike a balancing act, obviously. There are very different factions in Japan. He led a very conservative faction, but I think his legacy will be one that he certainly managed to balance it better than others did.
Well, Ananda, of course, his assassination today comes just days before the elections take place on Sunday, and Prime Minister Kishida speaking in Tokyo, as Tom mentioned, saying that he has instructed the cabinet to ensure free and fair elections, that they will take utmost security precautions for the election, that campaigning will continue tomorrow as planned. How could his death today influence the results of those votes on Sunday?
Well, the first point is that the government is going to go ahead with the upper house elections. That's obviously an important signal, because this obviously has been an attack on democracy for Japan, and of course an especially shocking attack given the low level of guns. Will go ahead with the results. It's difficult to know how, of course, it will permeate in terms of ultimately how people vote, but clearly there's a groundswell of sympathy for Abe, for this disaster. And I think looking at some of the initial takeaways on his legacy today, a lot of people seem to be focusing more over the positives. The positives in terms of what he tried to achieve for the economy. You know, he tried to get women back into the workforce. He tried to push through corporate governance reforms with mixed success, but he tried to. And of course, then as I was trying to explain earlier, on the global stage, he bolstered Japan's status. He tried to cut big trade deals, mend relations with China to some extent, and of course try and bolster its military standing on the global stage too. So I think at this stage, by all accounts, Japan is relisting the loss of what is clearly a political giant for the country.
The word I've heard several times this morning, Tom, was hope. And you remember when he came in for that second try as Prime Minister in Japan back in 2012. Tom, it was hope that this time around they could break out of several decades of stagnation.
The polarity here, John, and it's fascinating, is he was very clear that he was scarred forever by the imprisonment of his grandfather. And this is a guy that was strident that Japan had to re-engage militarily. But at the same time, as Mr. Curran just mentioned, this is a guy who had the courage to address liberality in Japanese society in a party that was hugely conservative.
A special thanks to Enda Curran on the latest. And Tom, the team in Asia doing a fantastic job also of just letting us all realize how rare this actually is. In all of Japan in 2021, 10 gun-related incidents.
Over the years, 6 Japanese prime ministers, former prime ministers assassinated. There's a trend, John, back centuries.
Waking up to the sad news out of Tokyo, Japan, that the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has died.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Ritika Gupta. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has died after being shot at a campaign event. It's stunning news in a country where political violence and guns are rare. A suspect has been arrested. Abe was 67. He was Japan's longest-serving Prime Minister and was best known for his shock therapy called Arbinomics to revive the economy. Boris Johnson is still in number 10 Downing Street after announcing he plans to resign, but his plans for an orderly retreat are being threatened. The ruling Conservative Party wants to speed up the contest to choose Johnson's successor by the end of summer. The Prime Minister's office had floated a 3-month timetable yesterday. And the European Central Bank's first major climate stress test shows banks facing a hit of $71 billion. That adds up credit and market losses from increasing natural disasters and sweeping changes across industries. We spoke with ECB Vice Chair Frank Helderson.
What we have seen is that a disorderly scenario is clearly more risky for banks than if there were to be an orderly scenario. This comes out of this bottom-up stress test that we are presenting today, which is a learning exercise, which is a pioneering exercise. It actually also came out of the broader financial sector macro stress test that the ECB did last year.
The ECB also found that 60% of banks don't have a climate risk stress testing framework. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
It's a challenging dynamic.
We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the House for business's greatest minds. Today, June jobs are in focus.
I think we're all very curious how June jobs came in.
The labor market is tremendously strong.
We have never been in a recession with declining unemployment.
Today, the surveillance team will bring you crucial data and expert analysis at terminal speed.
There's so much uncertainty. We're going to have to monitor the data closely.
Everyone needs to recalibrate at 8:31 a.m. this Friday.
The June Jobs Report, today on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Got a good chance at a soft landing here going forward. There are always risks, and if there's or a shock that we can't even think about today that will hit us, and that could happen. And we're always cognizant of risk. But I think the base case is for soft landing at this point.
That was Jim Bullard of the St. Louis Fed going into potentially another Fed meeting at the end of this month with a 75 basis point rate hike. Live from New York City this morning. Good morning. Together with Tom Keene, I'm Jonathan Ferro, alongside Kelly Lyons, counting you down to payrolls Friday, 2 hours away. Futures, negative 0.1% on the S&P, yields in a couple of basis points, 297.98. And we are on parity watch on euro dollar, a break of 101 earlier in the session, Tom, 101.32. And I was just looking at the chart on the dollar index, of course, a heavy weighting the euro has in that particular index. And Tom, it's up almost 10% since the end of Q1.
57% of the core DXY index. And John, what's important here is how lonely the euro is this morning. I look at other currency pairs and their triangulations, and this is distinctly a euro story.
Two problems there, hey, Tom. The weakness in growth, an ECB that's going to hike into it. And if you ask anyone this morning what's going to happen to the Eurozone economy, it's hard to find anyone constructive about the path ahead.
Yeah, I had fragmentation yesterday sitting on the runway at National Airport in Washington. It was fragmentation.
Is that what you're calling it?
So is Madame Lagarde calling it.
I hear that the ECB has a name for their anti-fragmentation.
Do they have a policy yet?
I'm not sure they have a policy, and that's the problem, Tom, not just a question.
Well, we're going to have to see as well. We are continuing to follow events in Japan, and we'll bring them to you as we can. Right now, on this moment of an American job economy, Stephen Whiting joins us, Chief Investment Strategist and Chief Economist, Citi Global Wealth. What do your troops think, Steve Whiting, of this jobs report? I can't frame it. To me, it's massively ambiguous. Am I right?
It's a transition period. You know, you hear people talk about, well, how could the economy weaken when employment is strong? And if you look at non-farm payrolls, the lead time it's given us before recessions, on average since World War II, is 0 months. Literally, again, it's a coincident indicator. If you don't believe me, take a look at the components of the index of leading economic indicators. You won't find it in there.
Steve, you are acclaimed at synthesizing the markets into equities. Help our market viewers today. On non-farm payrolls adjusted for pandemic gyrations, what is a soft non-farm payrolls number? Is it sub 200,000? Is it sub 300,000?
Yeah, if we were below 200,000 already, I would consider that soft. I would consider that on the way to a convincing slowdown. Now, again, where we are, where there's still a lot of production need, catch up in the economy, regardless of what happened to first half GDP gains. We've had consumer spending in the first half of the year after some downward revisions looks to be about a 1.5% pace. Do you need 300,000 to 400,000 jobs per month when core demand in the economy is decelerating? And this is before the effects of, let's call it 300 basis point rise in mortgage rates over 12 months, before the forthcoming tightening of monetary policy by the Fed. So if we look into 2023, financial markets are supposed to be telling us where the economy is going, not where they are right now. It looks like it's going to be a weaker period for employment. and could be considerably weaker in 2023.
So, Steve, what do you make of this rally, and what do you make of the churn beneath the index? The rally we've seen in tech, the sell-off we've seen in energy over the last month or so. How do you know whether something is the real deal or not?
Yeah, I think, again, we've been in a period where we've been so focused on interest rate risk along the booming cyclical conditions, higher inflation, so rate risk has been driving markets. I think we have to transition and say that, look, we've got rate risk more than priced, and now we have to take a look at a transition to credit risk. So if you think about the equity market, some of the underperformance of cyclicals, perhaps commodities, more subject to international events, but industrial cyclicals, companies that take a lot of credit risk and the consumer might not be there for them, they're starting to underperform some. And maybe some of the tech companies that have bond-like balance sheets and probably can weather any kind of bump in the economy over a year or two, they're starting to look like they're transitioning to a period where they could have a little more stability. It's a little early for that, but it's definitely the path I think we're on, transitioning from rate risk to credit risk.
What about earnings risk?
Well, again, it won't be necessarily the quarter we just finished, but where we are going ahead. If we can avoid a self-reinforcing downturn, we have to remember that we had 47% earnings growth last year. Profits are really high in the U.S. market. And so if you have a slowdown, it's going to take something out, even if the economy isn't in recession. So again, if you think about all the probability-weighted scenarios, it looks like we're going to have an earnings drop next year. And I don't think that that's going to be reflected so much in second quarter EPS. It won't be a quarter of big upward surprises. But the look backwards is not really that relevant. The one thing I won't worry about quite as much as others is downward earnings estimate revisions. The numbers are not plausible, and we know that stock prices predict analyst earnings estimates.
Steve, awesome to catch up, as always. Thanks for your patience this morning. Steve Whiting there of Citi Global Wealth Management. Into earnings next week. CPI next week on the 13th. And then on the 14th, you'll hear from JP Morgan. On the earnings front, Tom, we're looking for the guide forward. Does anyone have visibility about what this year might bring?
No, guidance is everything there, John. But I would link these together. And I'm going to be honest, John. I know we're supposed to hype the jobs report, so 12 people will stay with us to 8:30. But the inflation report next week is arguably more important. In the inflation report, John, folds into the earnings reality, and again, that guidance about what do they do with the revenue line.
The survey of Bloomberg, Tom, we gave you a sneak peek yesterday. 8.8% on headline year over year is the current median estimate. Getting a drip feed of estimates coming through. When we get more, we'll give you a better picture, but that's where things stand at the moment.
This is so important, John. You know, you go double digits, Spain and all that.
Sure.
We are, we're doing this every day, and we are benumbed by it as a statistical exercise. Our people listening and watching are living 4% inflation or 12% inflation, whatever it may be.
Let me give you a number, Tom. This came from Bank of America. They sent this over to me yesterday. For the lower income cohort who earn lower than 50K a year, gas prices rose to almost 10% of total monthly spend. Almost 10%. For some other people, Tom, that number's going to be higher.
This is really important. United Nations is doing great work on this, and it folds right over, John, from hydrocarbons over to food. For example, in Southeast Asia, the percent of income on rice.
Futures right now unchanged on the S&P 500, on the NASDAQ down about 0.2%. Big run in the NASDAQ so far this week. And we are on parity watch on euro-dollar. Euro-dollar a break of 101 briefly, 101.37 right now. From New York on this Payrolls Friday, this is Bloomberg.
Everyone you meet in Port Harcourt has stories about what they call black soot, caused by the manufacturing and consumption of these fuel products in the illegal refineries.
Oil theft, known as